So this West Berkshire local plan examination hearing session is now open. I'm William Fieldhouse, the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the plan. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. A reminder, please, for everyone to switch their mobile phones, laptops and other devices to silent mode. Water is provided and will be refilled during the adjournment, so please don't bring food or hot drinks into this room. Toilets are located out through the doors which you'll have come through, or just on the right-hand side out there. I've not been advised that there are any fire alarm tests planned for today. Council's shaking their head. So if the alarm does sound, please, we'll need to vacate the building in an orderly fashion, presumably following the emergency exit signs there or there. And we would muster, I think is the word, isn't it? Somewhere outside, presumably.
It's the car park of the Dolphin Hotel, which is just on the...
Okay, thank you. Presumably the best thing to do is follow the council because they'll know where they're going. Okay. Ian Kemp, the programme officer, who I'm sure you'll have been in contact with and probably met, he'll be around today. So if you need any assistance with the running of the proceedings, please have a word with him. This is the second week of hearings for the local plan examination. We dealt with matters 1 to 3 in week 1 at Shaw House the week before last. So today and tomorrow, we've got one matter to deal with, which is the North East Thatcham strategic site, and in particular policy SP17. In terms of how we'll run today and tomorrow, we'll probably have a comfort break for about 20 minutes around 11 o'clock this morning, and we'll break for lunch around 1 o'clock, but we can be flexible on those times depending on where we've got to on the agenda, etc. We'll finish by 5 o'clock today and resume again tomorrow at 9:30. Assuming, of course, that we haven't been through all the agenda items in today, which I'm not expecting to, but you never quite know how these things run. But we do have a full 2 days to deal with this, which obviously is one of the more controversial and significant parts of the plan. So we should have plenty of time to deal with it in the depth that it deserves. So a reminder that the purpose of the examination is to help me decide if the plan submitted in March 2023 is legally compliant and sound, and if not, how it could be modified to ensure that it is. So this session, like the others, will take the form of a structured discussion of the agenda items, which I think was published sometime last week. A revised agenda was published on Friday, which hopefully you've seen. And what I've tried to do incorporate within that are some of the council's responses to the action points arising from week 1, where they're relevant to the issues we're talking about today, or in one particular case, one of the participants here today, which I'll deal with in a moment. So in particular, you'll notice that the council's response to action point 1, which is about sustainability appraisal, action point 3, which is about the impact of development on the strategic road network and the views of national highways in particular. Action point 7, which is about policy SP2 and the way it deals with development within the setting of the AONB, or the national landscape. And at the end of the list of issues under this matter, I thought we'd deal with the settlement boundary of the designated employment area to the south of this allocated site on the eastern side of Thatcham. So under each issue, I'll start with some questions to the council, and then I'll open it up for others to contribute. If you wish to speak, please turn your nameplate up on end, and then I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. When I do invite you to speak, please turn your microphone on. Make sure it's pointing towards you at a reasonable height, because they do seem to pick up voices pretty well, but you do need to have them sort of probably lower than Mr. Pike's got here. Maybe you could show the example of and also you can bring it forward so you don't have to lean too forward over your desk to make sure it picks up your voice. If anyone can't hear me or anyone else at any time, do try and make sure I'm aware of that, and we'll sort of try and rectify that situation. So after we've dealt with each issue, and people have had a chance to have their say, I'll give the council the opportunity to sum up at the end of that particular issue before we move on to the next agenda item. As is normal in local plan examinations, the council has proposed some main modifications to the plan in response to questions that I've asked and things that have been discussed. A full schedule of the council's proposed modifications as at the 2nd of May, i.e. before the hearing started in week 1, was published on the 2nd of May, and that's document exam 23. So hopefully you've got that. However, in terms of policy SP 17, you may find it easier to refer to Appendix A in the council's written statement, which sets out the whole of the policy SP 17, incorporating the proposed modifications to it. That appendix also includes a revised site plan, which would replace the plan that's in submitted plan, which designates a specific developable area and a settlement boundary, along with road access points. So we'll deal with that in due course. Following week one, I did publish some action points, which are things that I had identified during the 2 days of hearing sessions. And I will do likewise following this week. They'll probably be published next week, those action points. The council should also just keep a note of any such things or things that it thinks it needs to sort of deal with in response to the way the discussions go. As I've mentioned, the action points from week one, some of which have been responded to and some of which I've built into the agenda. So we'll deal with those in due course. The fact that I've issued some action points doesn't mean I've made up my mind on those matters, definitely. Some are obviously probably clearer than others. Some of them are relatively minor in nature. It's also possible that there are things that I don't issue an action point about shortly after the hearing sessions because I just need longer to think about it, or there's other associated issues and matters we're going to talk about before I reach a conclusion. So don't think that I've finished my deliberations just because something isn't covered in an action point relating to a particular policy or issue. So I think what I'll do now, before I just check see if there's any procedural issues that people wish to query before we start, I'll go around and let everyone introduce themselves who are at the table. If I could start with the council, please.
So good morning again. My name's Emmeline Lambert, council instructed to represent West Berkshire District Council.
Morning, Laura Callan, West Berkshire Council.
Rachel Lancaster, West Berkshire Council.
Sally Powell, representing WSP. We've done the transport modelling for the local plan.
Alec Gore, Transport Policy Team Leader, West Berkshire Council.
Good morning, sir. Alan Dival, Walsingham Planning, representing the Colthrop Village Consortium.
Good morning, Matthew Spry from Lichfields, representing the North East Action Partnership.
Good morning, sir. Rupert Warren, KC, also part of the North East Action team.
Damien Ford from Transport Planning Associates, representing the North East Action team.
Morning, sir. Mike Bodkin, Town, on behalf of Pinson's Lane.
Morning, sir. Roger Tastain, Nexus Planning, on behalf of Crowdace Homes.
Good morning, sir. Mark Foster, Birdwood Surgery Practice Manager.
Good morning, sir. Jeff Eaton, NHS, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Berkshire West Integrated Care Board.
Morning, sir. Paul Goriap, Chartered Ecologist with Bucklebury Parish Council.
Morning, sir. Andrew Black Consulting on behalf of Bucklebury Parish Council. We also have Paul Willis from Yes Engineering dealing with transport matters, so we'll hot desk at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Councillor Simon Pike representing Thatcham Town Council and also Simon Pike individual representative. Thank you.
Morning, sir. My name is Chris Reed and I'm member of the council for Bucklebury Ward.
Just to clarify, Mr. Reid, you're a member of West Berkshire Council for Bucklebury Ward, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you all for that. Is there any, before I, just going to deal with the matter of the council response to action point 1 and the sustainability appraisal consultation before we move on to North East Action. But just before I do that, has anyone got any procedural queries about what I've said in the introduction and about in particular the action points that have been issued so far and council's responses to them and when they'll be considered? No, good, okay. Sorry, NHS and Burnwood studio, surgery, if you want to grab another microphone, and make it easier for yourselves, there's the spare one just to your right. So if you want to do that, feel free to do so. Thank you. Right, so I think we may as well just deal with this sustainability appraisal. A particular issue was raised by Mr. Pike in the on the first day of the hearings, I think. And it was around the compliance with the regulations relating to the sustainability appraisal that had been carried out. So action point 1 asked the council to do a note clarifying that in liaison with Mr. Pike. So do you want to just very briefly outline what that note tells us, and then I'll see if Mr. Pike's got any further comments or queries about it.
So thank you. Yes, the response of the council to AP1 included setting out the relevant regulations, the SEA regulations that were, so far as the council could ascertain, the ones that concerned Mr. Pike in particular. And they were set out in full in the note so far as they were relevant. And the council submits that they are not to be interpreted rigidly. There is case law as set out in the note at paragraph 5, the Friends of the Earth case. That one is not directly on point because it relates to the interpretation of public affected in the regulations. But in my submission, the principle can be carried across. And the bottom line is that when it comes to performing the duties imposed on the local authority in relation to consultation, much of it is a matter of judgment for the local authority. And that's expressly set out in Regulation 13, because at Regulation 13 2b, the authority only need take such steps, and I quote, as it considers appropriate to bring the preparation of the relevant documents to the attention of the persons who, in the opinion of the authority, are affected or likely to be affected or have an interest. And so there is a further case, it's not mentioned in the note, but I do think it's helpful. It's Kendal and Rochford District Council, and I can provide it in due course. If I can just read you paragraph 58 of that, which says that Regulation 18 of the 2012 regulations is not concerned specifically with an authority's use of its statement of community involvement. It affords ample scope for the authority to exercise its own judgment in deciding whom it is going to consult on the draft plan and how. Paragraph 2C allows the authority to decide for itself which residents and businesses should be invited to make representations on a draft plan. Once again, the authority is only required to invite representations from those whom it considers appropriate to ask, and that is for the authority to judge in the particular circumstances of the process in hand, bearing in mind the stage of the process that has reached. So the local authority has set out in the note how it did so, and also that Mr. Pike did make representations. And in my submission, that is relevant because the ultimate, if this were to go the ultimate course, then one of the things that would be considered is whether any prejudice or substantial prejudice had been caused. And there hasn't been any prejudice at all. And the other thing that Mr. Pike complains about is that representations were not taken into account. The council is not required to set out each and every representation and how it has taken it into account. The council confirms it has had regard to all the representations. And so, sir, whilst Mr. Pike continues to particularise and his arguments continue to evolve around how the council has not complied with the regulations in regard to consultation, in my submission it has, and it is time to draw a line under it.
Just to clarify then, you've set some caveats there, because it gives explaining that the council has a discretion because it takes appropriate, of course, what it considers appropriate. Is that because there are some things within Reg 13 that's very specific that may not have been followed to the letter? Is that why you're saying that, or is that not the case anyway?
We don't think that's the case anyway.
Right.
It's just
things
that
like telephone numbers and places where things are published and those.
Well, those things all happen.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Okay, thank you. In terms of Reg 8, I'm finding it again now. Reg 8.1 I think this is about the stage where things happen. A plan programme or modification in respect to which determination under Reg 9.1 is required should not be adopted or submitted to the legislative procedure for the purpose of its adoption. Have we reached that stage yet or not?
No.
No. So the Reg 19 stage is still part of the plan preparation for the purpose of the SEA regs.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
It's
Sorry, I'm not, don't
sorry,
agree with me. I'm asking a
it's,
question.
sorry, yes, it's ongoing.
Yeah, okay. So even if something hadn't been done to the letter, the point where everything has to have been done is later on after this examination. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Right. And I think that was what behind my second part of my question is what steps would need to be taken in the future. So when the modifications are published for consultation, there will be an update to the sustainability appraisal. And again, the council will invite comments on that and I will consider those, the council will consider those and I will consider those. But even after that, when the plan is actually finally sent for adoption, there's another, the essays finalised at that point?
Yes, so it's at the point of adoption that everything crystallises, as it were, in terms of the legal duties. And if there were any inadequacies, as set out in the note, the council will consider those carefully, consider the wording of any future correspondence carefully.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Pike, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if there's any outstanding, you've seen the council's response and you've heard the explanation there. Is there anything further you wish to say?
Thank you. So I have a few points. So I think there's some lack of clarity as to whether the council intended to consult on the sustainability appraisal at the time of the Regulation 19 consultation. And so the PPG guidance says that the sustainability process should be taken into account when the local planning authority develops its timetable. And if you look at the local development scheme, which was submitted, it's clear that the Regulation 19 time did not include consultation on the sustainability appraisal. Also, if you look at the wording of the letter of invitation and the consultation statement, you would reach a different conclusion as to whether the detailed points, the detailed requirements of the sustainability regulations were complied with. There are some things which are required for that, which are not required in Regulation 19, and those things are not there. Finally, I think the most important.
What things are not there?
Well, the sustainability regulations requires that the council makes available a process by which you can obtain a copy of them by post, and that is not stated there. I think that in itself is, I think, a fairly minor matter, but it's indicative that the Regulation 19 consultation was not at the time envisaged to be a consultation on the sustainability appraisal. I think more.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I think that the council explanation is that the letter refers to the plan and supporting evidence or supporting documents, and that presumably they would say was an umbrella term to include the sustainability appraisal.
But the point is that if you are consulting on the sustainability appraisal, there are certain explicit requirements in those regulations which are not there which are not required for Regulation 19, and those are not present in that document.
You mentioned one.
Yeah, there are, I can go through a detailed list, but there are about 3 or 4.
Well, do you want to tell me what they are? Making copies available by post.
Yes, and I think firstly there's a requirement to invite, and it's only the document only states that the sustainability appraisal exists. There's no invitation to comment on it. If you were to look at the guidance note, which I don't think is part of the submission, but it was sent to all of it, says each representation, including comments on the supporting information or evidence base, should relate to an individual policy or section of the local plan review. In other words, it was clearly expected that you would not make independent comments on the sustainability appraisal at that time. And you'll find that there are equivalent comments less explicit within the consultation statement and the letter of invitation.
Sorry, what you're saying is because of the way the consultation was set up, they wanted to focus people's comments on parts of the plan.
Yeah.
There wasn't an explicit invitation to comment on these.
There's no reference to it as being a consultation on the sustainability appraisal. Perhaps more important is this question about whether the council having considered the comments that were made on the sustainability appraisal. And I would have to leave it to you, sir, to determine whether the submission to the Secretary of State in regulation of the local plan to the Secretary of State triggers that wording that you quoted from the regulations as the starting the legislative process. And I can't give you a legal opinion. I can't find any reference which explains that, but I'm sure that the inspectorate will determine that. But just to say there that unfortunately this happened after the deadline for comments, but in light of what the council said, I made a freedom of information request to the council for internal documentations about consideration of the comments on the sustainability appraisal, and they made an explicit response, which I followed up for a confirmation that there is no internal documentation relating to consideration of comments on the sustainability appraisal. So but that by the time, well, in fact, I think I asked by the time of the submission, but there is no that they have explicitly stated that there is no internal documentation relating to the consideration of the comments on the sustainability appraisal. Thank you.
Well, two things. One, notwithstanding the fact that you don't think you were invited to comment and there weren't copies available by post, you did comment on the sustainability appraisal.
Yeah, so yes, but both myself and the town council did, but we felt that we were sort of massaging something into the text that wasn't intended, because you had to find a reason to comment in relation to the local plan itself, and there was no mechanism to comment directly on the sustainability appraisal.
Okay, and in terms of the council's consideration of the essay, comments on the essay, is it not the case that there's a very long report, isn't there, statement, I can't remember what the reference is, but I think you know the one I mean, which summarises for each policy the main issues raised, who's made them, and I think in there, for policy SP17 and other parts of the plan, there are some references to comments about the sustainability appraisal, and I think that's when we dealt with this in week 1, that's how they explained they did it, rather than to pull them out and present them separately as a comments on the sustainability appraisal.
Thank you. There are comments about what respondents said. There are no comments about what the council thought about them. So all it is a summary of the comments, not an assessment or review consideration of them. Thank you.
Right, I think, okay, so thank you. I think your concerns have been elaborated upon, and I think I understand them. And I think at the end of the council's note, it basically said that when further consultation is carried out on the plan and accompanying documents, it can be and is willing to be more explicit about covering the sustainability appraisal. Anything else you want to say before we move on?
So just on that regulation 13 2C2 that Mr. Pike drew your attention to. This is about obtaining a copy of the relevant documents by post.
Yes.
In relation to every other element of regulation 13C, the council complied. In relation to 13C 13C3, it caveats that by saying, provided that it is reasonably practicable for the authority to provide a copy by post. It's not mandatory. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, any other, Mr. Pike.
Thank you. Just in conclusion, I think one of the key questions is if the point of submission to the Secretary of State is not the submission for the legal process, the exact wording, then there is no further opportunity for the council to take into account the comments that it might review subsequently. So if it hasn't reviewed the comments that it received on the sustainability appraisal by then, there's nothing more it can do about it, because it has no further opportunity to modify the local plan as a result. And therefore that might indicate that the intention was that submission to the Secretary of State is the triggering of that wording of the starting of the legal process that you referred to in your wording. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think the council did consider the comments on the sustainability appraisal as part of consideration of the issues around the policies in the plan. I'll also consider well, that's what the council have said. Okay, fine. But I'll also consider the comments about the policies in the plan. I'm examining the plan. I'm not examining directly the soundness of sustainability appraisal or the comments about it. I mean, that's all part of a huge amount of information and evidence that is part of the justification for and explanation for the policies in the plan, which ultimately are the things I am going to focus on. So I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but I think we've explored that fully today. And if I've got any further concerns or things that I think need to be done, I'll make it known in the usual way. Okay, thank you. Right, does anyone else have any comments or questions, points about that sustainability appraisal? No. Okay, thank you. It's, to my mind, it's quite a nice cool temperature in here, and it'll probably warm up during the day. Everyone presumably is no one's too cold, and I know there's some cold air sort of coming in, but you're comfortable enough over that side? Yeah, thank you. Good. Right then, let's now move on then, if we could, to matter 4, which is policy SP17 in the plan and the associated text and maps that go with that. So my understanding is that SP17 relates to a greenfield site of around 170 hectares, which is on the north-east edge of Thatcham, about a kilometre from the town centre and the railway station. The policy proposes approximately 1,500 new homes on the site during the planned period, at least 40% of which would be affordable. The new homes would be accompanied by local shops, a GP surgery, primary school, early years provision, secondary school, community centre, formal and informal sports pitches, other green infrastructure and transport infrastructure, including walking and cycling routes and improvements to existing roads. So that's a very brief summary of what the policy proposes. The first issue that I'm going to deal with then is 4.1. There's 2 parts to that. The first is about the reasonable alternatives that were considered before policy SP17 was finalised for inclusion in the submitted plan. We dealt last week with the broader issue of the spatial strategy and the reasonable alternatives that were considered as that, and a decision was made to, as part of those considerations, to have an increased focus on Thatcham, I think is the way it was expressed. So once that decision had been made, it was decided, i.e. to focus more on Thatcham for the reasons that are set out and summarised in the plan. The council identified a number of options based on the call for sites and the housing and employment land availability assessment. So I think these were summarised in your statement or elsewhere, but I've noted them down as being 2,500 dwellings at north-east Thatcham, 1,500 dwellings at north-east Thatcham, 800 dwellings at Colthrop, and that's land to the south of the town. 100 dwellings in the Newbury-Thatcham Gap, 250 dwellings at Hennick and north-east Thatcham combined with development at Hennick. And there's a map that I've got which shows the HELA sites around the town, and they are basically, they're numbered, and we can talk to those if necessary, but that's basically what was available for the council to decide to choose from. And I think that when the sustainability appraisal seems to say that other than the 2,500 at north-east Thatcham, or the 1,500 there, those were the only ones that were considered reasonable alternatives in terms of being a strategic site. That's correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So the other locations around the town and the various different sites that could have been chosen but were not ultimately were rejected in strategic terms because they weren't big enough to be a strategic site or close enough to north-east Thatcham to make a kind of a package that would be a strategic approach. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
So those sites then were discarded because the council's preferred option for Thatcham and this element of the overall spatial strategy for the district was to have a strategic site, because that would deliver things that a collection of smaller sites would not. That's the basic essence of that.
Yes, that's correct.
So the council, and this now flows into one of the action points from week 1, which asked you to identify which of the non-allocated sites that were identified through the HELA and sustainability appraisal were, in their own terms, leaving aside the strategy, potentially suitable and potentially available. And you responded to that on Friday, I think last week, and identified a number of the sites that were identified through the HELA and SA that were not allocated. I think there were 5 that you say are suitable, some of which are known to be available, some would have to be checked, and that's right. The reason I mentioned that today, because I will put those on the agenda for when we look at the allocations for the non-strategic allocations in the different parts of the district later this week and then in week 3. The reason I mention it now is because 3 of those, I think, form part of the package of sites at Henwick that was collected. They were collectively decided not to be taken forward because they didn't amount to a sufficiently large strategic site to deliver what the council wanted. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
But now you've basically said that they're still not a strategic site, but they potentially are suitable and available for non-strategic development at some point.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. Fine. In terms of the other potentially strategic site, the land at Colthrop, which I think collectively it comprised a number of sites, numbered 1, 3, 4, and 5. Thatcham 1, 3, 4, and 5. And collectively they were discarded for a number of reasons. One was flood zone 2 and 3 on some of that land. And maybe you could just elaborate on that. And poor transport links, presumably to serve the site and into the town, and also a safeguarded mineral processing plant that affected some of it. So collectively, I think the SA referred to potentially 800 dwellings. Some of that was discarded for those constraints. Is that right? Do you know roughly how many?
I don't, but we could find out.
Okay. I think the site promoters of Thatcham 1, who say it consists of around 100 hectares south of Thatcham and east of the train station, is potentially suitable for 950 homes. That doesn't seem to quite add up with the council's figures, but leaving that aside.
Yeah, I think that's just to do with the different ways we do calculations. We've used our pattern book approach.
But in terms of Thatcham 1 then, this is roughly a 100 hectare site. That was the biggest part of that collection of sites. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you didn't identify Thatcham 1 in the list that you gave me on Friday as being potentially suitable and available because of what? The constraints you referred to earlier?
I think it's the significance of the flood risk on the site. I just need to check it. I'll just get a colleague to confirm that. Okay, so some parts, smallish parts of some sites, I think we dealt with this. I've dealt with through questions I've already asked you, and we dealt with it briefly in week 1. There are small parts of some sites that are allocated in the plan that are at flood zone 2 or 3 and 2 and/or 3, and maybe subject to surface water flooding as well. But they're sufficiently limited in extent that you can accommodate development on the allocation to meet the things. In this case, he's saying a significant part of that 100 hectares is at risk of flooding. That means that you couldn't accommodate a significant number of dwellings on it. Yeah.
Okay. Rightio, thank you. Anything else you want to say about the reasonable alternatives? Because I don't want to get into too much detail about these mission sites, but the reasons that the council opted for the preferred option of the North East Thatcham against the others was because it was seen as a reasonable alternative and it was a better alternative. In fact, the others weren't reasonable in the council's view. And I suppose even if someone argued they were reasonable, the council's view may be that they weren't as good a site as the North East Thatcham one.
Yes, that's correct. We're looking for a strategic site as a single development to get the infrastructure that's required on the site rather than piecemeal development that might not bring the infrastructure benefits that are required.
So, sorry, I mean, just to finish on the Colthrop one, and we'll invite the views from others shortly. If it was suitable for 950 and you could manage the flood risk and it would deliver a bridge over the railway line, if the council agreed with all that, would that change things?
Or would that be, well, if that were the case, you're not convinced, but if that were the case, that could be something that could be looked at in the future?
Yes, I mean, we've looked at it now and don't consider it to be a reasonable alternative. But if it could be demonstrated that it was, we would consider it in the future as another option.
Right. Okay, I haven't got any more questions from the council about the regional alternatives. I think I understand those. As I say, we will look at the other non-strategic allocations in this area later in the week. And again, we can look at the reasonable alternatives that were available or are available there, as well as those if necessary. So comments from others on what you've heard so far? Yes, Walsingham Planning.
Yes, sir, thank you. So I won't repeat in detail the information that you have in front of you in terms of both my client's Regulation 18, Regulation 19 consultation responses, and obviously our hearing statements. But my client has prepared detailed flood modelling information that was produced by Peter Brett Associates, who I now believe are Stantec. And that demonstrates that through mitigation, Site 1, which is the Colthrop Village Consortium site, can deliver 950 homes outside of flood zones 2 and 3. So it's not quite correct in terms of what the council said there, that the site cannot deliver a strategic allocation and a strategic number of homes in terms of 950. But I won't repeat and obviously go through all the detail of that information that you have in front of you, sir.
But in terms of, I mean, obviously your client's position is that they want that land to be brought forward for housing development. You've also identified some benefits that would arise from that in terms of transport infrastructure, as you say. So all well and good. In terms of it being a strategic site or a reasonable alternative to North East Thatcham, I mean, presumably the suitability of that in your client's terms isn't dependent on their North East Thatcham not being available. It could be brought forward as well, presumably, as part of a spatial strategy that seeks to focus development, particularly on Newbury and Thatcham as being the main towns in the district.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't think that we're saying it's a case of remove one strategic allocation over our strategic allocation. I think it's very much a case of this site is deliverable, in particular in terms of the flood risk issues that the council seem to have ruled the site out of.
And in terms of the council, we're going to come on to what SP 17 proposes, but obviously it's not just the 1,500 homes. It's a new secondary school, primary school, early years. It's got community facilities, local shops, a whole package of things, which is the council's case, I think, would be, well, it's a collective package that needs to be delivered, and that would deliver certain benefits. So when you say 950 homes could be delivered outside flood zone 2 and 3, the council, I don't know, they may have had a chance to look at that, I don't know, but, that's not a proposal before me. But would that also include those sort of community facilities and other aspects of what SP 17 is proposing?
Yes, sir. The scheme that our client has put forward can deliver the required infrastructure that's needed for 950 new homes.
That's not quite what I asked you. Could it deliver the same package of things that SP 17 delivers? I mean, would it provide an on-site secondary school and a new surgery, which wouldn't necessarily be necessary for 950 homes, but that's what SP 17 is proposing to deal with existing problems as well as the needs of the development.
Yeah, I don't think that we're saying, or we have said that we'll deliver infrastructure, community facilities, etc., over and above what's needed for the 950 homes. Yeah.
So that would be potentially a primary school, would it, for 950?
Yeah, that's correct, sir. Yeah.
But not a secondary school on site.
No.
But a financial contribution to increase capacity to a secondary school elsewhere.
Yes, sir. Correct. Yeah.
Not a GP surgery on site.
I
A
think
health centre, or possibly.
Our scheme provides a local centre, and within that local centre, yes, it could include health facilities, etc.
So you've got floor space that could accommodate a package of different things for in local centre definitions.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Understood. Okay. I may as well ask you now while you're on and while it's sort of relevant. You'll have seen the council's, so I assume you'll have seen the council's response to the settlement boundary issue relating to the, is it Colthrop Industrial Estate, the designated employment area anyway, to the east of the town and north of the land that you're referring to?
Yeah.
You've seen the council's response to
that? Yes, I have, and I think again, I won't repeat what I said a couple of weeks ago, but from our perspective, you know, we found it very odd that very significant employment area was not wrapped up within the settlement boundary, given its relationship with the existing settlement. I've seen what the council have said. I think the council, correct me if I'm wrong, are basically saying that it could be included within the settlement boundary, but I don't think they're being particularly definitive in terms of saying they will change the settlement boundary, but they're saying there could be an argument made for why it could be within the settlement boundary, and of course we would say it should be.
Yeah, okay, but your position's the same. It clearly should be. That's your point.
Correct.
I mean, the council described it as an unbalanced decision, and you could have done it either way based on the criteria that they've used. So, okay, no, I just thought I may as well deal with that now whilst you're on.
Okay,
just in case you don't want to spend, I put it as the very last item on the issues under this matter. So I thought I may as well give you a chance to mention it now.
Okay,
right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, Nexus Planning.
Thank you, sir. I discussed last week the principle about a strategic site and an allocation, so I'm not going to reiterate that. I think my point is some of the process in coming up with the options within the strategic site. Clearly, the boundary for the Reg 19 plan was effectively the boundary submitted by the North East Thatcham Consortium, which was considered in the Thatcham study. So it covered a much wider area than the necessary of the 1,500 houses. The North East Thatcham study looks at a number of HELA submissions, which include ours, and it came to the conclusion that the consortium looked at a combination of sites, and that could accommodate 2,500 houses, and they took the view that that was the most appropriate strategic site. And I'm not arguing that our site is a strategic site. They then decided to reduce the quantum of housing. Now, my understanding was that quantum reduction wasn't down to physical constraints or the fact that the original site couldn't accommodate 2,500 houses. It was for other reasons, which is set out in the council sustainability appraisal, ostensibly relating to concerns with the community, objecting to that level of growth, and political concerns. What the council didn't do is examine within the North East Thatcham HELA areas what parcels could accommodate the 1,500 houses. So they didn't go back one stage and look at these submissions and then identify the fact that part of the site could accommodate 1,500 houses in a land efficient way. What they effectively did is keep the boundary exactly the same. So what you have now, sir, is a site which is effectively constrained to accommodate 1,500 houses. We're talking about the green buffer later on, but that provides a constraint to further growth. The Thatcham strategy, the strategic vision, talks about long-term growth in Thatcham and North Newbury up to the period 2050. This plan is providing for 1,500 houses on a land area that I believe is larger than necessary to accommodate the 1,500 houses. Again, going back to the Thatcham study, you will have seen in the I think it's SET3, the final master plan study. It breaks down a number of communities at North East Thatcham, and they have capacities attributed to them. Either combination of those communities would accommodate your 1,500 houses. So I think my point is the sustainability appraisal and the alternatives need to look at the alternatives within the area currently identified within the boundary, as well as alternative locations which we've discussed. So my point really is that the sustainability appraisal needs to look at potentially a reduced scale scheme for North East Thatcham, which can be accommodated within that area. Otherwise, you're prejudicing the potential for longer term growth within the context of the 2050 study.
Well, the sustainability appraisal did look at the 1,500 option.
It looked at the 1,500 option within the same boundary as the £2,500 option. What it didn't do is say we're now looking at 1,500 houses and almost go back to stage one and say, look, the brief now is to look at how we can accommodate 1,500 houses. Where's the best location to accommodate those 1,500 houses? And what, again, if you go back to the Thatcham study, that could be accommodated on a smaller site than currently being proposed.
Okay. And in terms of the land at Hennick then, which the council now say is suitable, that's of interest to you, yeah?
Absolutely, and of course it is, yeah. As we accept that it doesn't form part of the strategic site as identified with the council, but it is a site that can come forward within the first 5 years of the plan period. We'll come on to delivery rates later on, I think, sir. But the Hennick site, certainly again in combination with a smaller site, wasn't assessed either appropriately in our view. That was the point I made last week.
Yeah.
I didn't want to repeat that.
But okay, I mean, there's a limit to the number of different alternatives that, you know, sustainability appraisal can break down into. I think I understand the point you're making. You could have done it differently, but I'm not sure anything was particularly missed in terms of considering different scales of development at North East Thatcham and also considering options at Hennick, including your land and other bits of land as well. So
I think the point I'm making, sir, is that the site that's been identified as an allocation can accommodate 2,500 houses based on the council's evidence. So if you look at the boundary of the site that's been identified, it can accommodate that level of growth. And it's a question you raised about, are there any aspirations to deliver more than 1,500 within the planned period? And the council says no. All I'm saying is that in terms of good planning, there seems to be a larger site that's allocated and is necessary to accommodate the 1,500 houses. So looking at long term to the future, they're reducing their options.
But we'll look at the policies and what's going to be accommodated and what the developable area is and what will happen on the other bits. But I don't quite understand. Are you saying that the plan should be modified to include a bigger number for North East Thatcham, or that somehow the allocation should be reduced in size at North East Thatcham?
All I'm saying, sir, is the council has taken a view that 1,500 houses is an appropriate scale for strategic growth to deliver the benefits, and that's the view they've taken. There are alternative options within the North East Thatcham boundary that could accommodate that 1,500 houses. Again, if you go back to the Thatcham study, sir, the boundary which is being proposed now for North East Thatcham is exactly the same as the North East Thatcham study.
When you say the boundary, you mean the red line, don't you?
The red line boundary.
Not the settlement boundary or the developable area.
No, the red line the site boundary is
Well,
the same scale.
if they move the red line, then would this overcome whatever this concern of yours is? If they move the red line to the settlement boundary, for example, would that overcome your concern?
Well, I just think they haven't looked at within that red line boundary. They haven't looked at the options.
Right. Okay, let's leave it there. I think I get the point, and we're going to look at the assumptions made about the developable area and how it would accommodate and what densities it assumes, and you know the school and all those other bits and pieces and the open space. So, thank you. And in terms of the non-strategic allocations, just to be clear, we're going to deal with the allocations in the plan on Thursday in the Newbury Thatcham area, and on the agenda for that I have included the other potentially suitable sites, so we can come back to the Hennick site then.
That's one question I was going to ask, sir, because we weren't originally down for that session, but now it's changed. We've spoken to the programme officer.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, obviously, just to be clear, I'm examining the plan as submitted. The reason that I asked the council to do that bit of work, it was from the council's position at one point seemed to be every site that's allocated, every site that is suitable and available is allocated in the plan, and then it was sort of changed to say, well, with the exception of some because they weren't considered necessary, and that was the clarification that was provided with the list on Friday. Obviously, I'm not examining those sites because they're not in the plan. I'm examining the plan. Obviously, if I get to a point where I think the plan needs to be modified for whatever reason, Potentially other sites could come into consideration. I'm not saying that is the case, but anyway, we've got the council's position on a number of the sites, including the Hennick one that you're interested in. So we can talk about that on Thursday.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Right. Bucklebury Parish Council.
Thank you, sir. So I think we have a wider concern just on the sequence of what came about in terms of the selection of this site and the consideration of reasonable alternatives. So from our perspective, and the council will obviously correct me if I'm wrong here, but you had the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study. And we know, sir, and the council will confirm this, that was paid for by the promoters of North East Thatcham as a document. That started, or you had a three-stage process. So stage one, the date on that was May 2019. And obviously there was lead up to that process before that. And that I think there's a reference in that to initial meetings in November 2018, I think. So we know that was paid for by the partnership. We know that there was an initial stage in May 2019 that really set out some background and hadn't set the site at that point. And then by April 2020, there's within that document a review of all the HELAR sites, and then it obviously highlights this site for selection. And then the stage three, which was more on the master planning, was September 2020. And Hennick Park was discounted at that point as it wasn't contiguous with the site area. So that had kind of rattled through. And you got to a point of September 2020 where SP17 or THA20 as it was back then had been selected. And then from my perspective, sir, you've then got an SEA dated December 2020. Granted, work was being undertaken before then, but that was then talking about reasonable alternatives. But by that point, our position is, well, that this site had already been selected. And we heard at the initial matters statements, the council saying that they'd effectively selected by that point North East Thatcham. And our simple position is, sir, we're being told that reasonable alternatives were considered, but they were considered after the point that the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study had concluded that this site was the site. And that's our simple point in terms of the sequencing that this came about. It is a fundamental issue in our mind.
But when you say the sustainability appraisal December 2020, set out some reasonable alternatives and appraised them, but that was the date of that report, the SA report, was it not?
I never said that, sir.
So the process doesn't the SA go on in parallel with the plan making process, and it's a kind of iteration going on? And in informing the SA, would it not take account of emerging evidence and studies like the Thatcher Growth Study? I mean, when you say a decision had been made in the Thatcher Growth Study, well, that was a bit of work to inform the plan, was it not?
It was. I mean, our position is, at what point was that decision made that this was the site that was coming forward? Given you had a body of work that had started in November 2018 that was paid for by the promoters of this site.
You don't need to keep saying that.
I know. You've asked me a question and I'm answering it. So at what point had the council decided that this site was the site that was being selected, and how does that work with reasonable alternatives? That's our point.
But if the SA process had started in 2018 or 17 or whenever it was, or, and it was going on in parallel, isn't that a normal process?
Well, maybe so, but from my point of view, there is just simply not the evidence in front of you to explain that sequence and what happened when. And that to me is not clear. Now, the council may have a position on that, but the evidence in front of you as part of this examination, it is not clear how that came about. And to me, that is an area that I'm completely unclear about, and we are. And from the community's point of view, they see that you had this strategic growth study and the site was selected, and then everything fed in from that. That's the key concern. Yeah. Now, there may be an explanation.
Does the SA not set out the explanation, i.e. it sets out the reasonable alternatives that were considered at the district level, and then it considered the reasonable alternatives within the option of focusing more on Thatcham?
Well, it says that may have been done, but to me, it is simply not clear of the sequence and the dates that came about for that process.
Okay. but you don't dispute that that's what the essay does. It appraises a number of options. Well, the report, as you say, dated December 2020, sets out what those options were, and it sets out the appraisal it carried out of them.
Perhaps, but in our submission, sir, an SEA, an essay should be an iterative process. It should follow through that process. And it's not clear how those iterations worked and what happened. You should select sites, you should test them, you should go back, reconsider. That's not clear in my mind. There may be an explanation to this. It may be that those around the table have a different perspective, very willing to hear it. But from our perspective, what we're putting to you, sir, is that that's not clear in the evidence.
The HELA, we dealt with the HELA process, didn't we, in week 1? And I can't remember the exact dates, but I think that went back to a call for sites back in 2017 or 18 or something like that. So this process had been going on for a number of years, up to December 2020, where, you know, sites have been put forward and assessed through the HELA and the SA. Is that not the case?
It was, but put simply again, a lot of that reference of the HELA sites was done in stage 2 with the strategic growth study. Okay, so there's a lot, and our position is that effectively the reasonable alternatives and the assessing of different sites was outsourced into that document, into the strategic growth study, and that looked at that, but that was being paid for by the promoters of this site. And I know I've said that several times, but that's, in our perspective, that's what you have. You have an outsourcing of saying, well, look at the best sites, but that's done in a document that's outside of what the council were doing. And that is our fundamental issue here.
Your fundamental issue is you don't believe the council went into this process with an open mind after around whatever the commission, well, the Thatcham strategic growth study starting in 2008, late 2018-19. You think at that point the council had made his mind up?
All we're saying, sir, is that the evidence in front of you is unclear of the timing of that, and I think we say that it is worrying that you have a document that's paid for by the promoters of a site.
Okay, right.
Doing that.
Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So Thatcham Town Council doesn't have a view about the viability of the various sites, but we have a comment about the claim by the West Berkshire Council that only the North East Thatcham site can deliver the required infrastructure. Because on the one hand, it does not deliver a viable school or a viable GP surgery. And on the other hand, other parts of the infrastructure are divisible. So 2 primary schools can be put on 2 sites. A particular area of community facilities can be divided. So I don't think there is an evidence base to support that claim that only the North East Thatcham site can deliver the infrastructure. Thank you, sir.
Okay, well, I'll come on to the various aspects of the community infrastructure. And you mentioned, I think, school, the community centre, the health centre, the surgery. I think you've made the point, well, there could be other better locations in the town where these...
I'm making at this point the specific point about the claim that only this site can provide the infrastructure. We'll come on to the details of each element later, I'm sure. Thank you.
Right, okay, thank you. In terms of reasonable alternatives, I'm still on issue 4.1 and the reasonable alternatives. I'll go to Lichfields and then I'll see if there's any other comments and go back to the council.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to touch on what we say in our representations on the 4.1, because even though, as you know, the promoters of North East Thatcham agree with the selection of the site, so in the kind of macro sense, if you like, so we're not disputing the process that was gone through, and we strongly disagree with the points about prejudgment or outsourcing, etc., because the council's iterative process has many stages to it, so that you've seen set out in the evidence, and we touch on all of that, including the HELA, the SA, and the Thatcham growth study aspects to it in the representations that we made. So in broad terms, in terms of identifying the site as a single large strategic allocation, we're unsurprisingly in agreement with the council. But before we left the question of alternatives, I did want to touch on something that we will come back to. And it does go to alternatives properly, if you like, sir, because when you look back at the November 22 addendum essay, that's where in table 30 for your notes, sir, which is on page 38 and following, you have this change from 2,500 to 1,500. And to a large degree, so I'd echo what Mr. Tustin said earlier on, the site largely stays the same, but there is some wording in that table which explains or purports to explain the planning basis for changing the numbers from 2,500 to 1,500. And so all I'd say, and I won't repeat what we said in our representations, is when you contrast the essay methodology, which has its usual, reds and oranges and greens and all the planning objectives in various different ways in a way that you're fully familiar with, sir. None of those relates to the 2 points that are made about which justify the decision to go from 2,500 to 1,500. Because as Mr. Tustin, I think, echoed it earlier on, what is said is the potential impact on the local community is considered too high, nothing further about that. And politically, a reduced number on the site is considered to be more acceptable. And that is why that, as it were, alternative option is not taken forward. That's why I'm dealing with this, sir, in terms of alternatives rather than just making the general point. So we'll come back to it because it goes to all manner of things about capacity and whether it's a better scheme and would achieve the objectives at 2,500. But that's procedurally where the roads fork, where the decision is made. And we have made the point, so I just ask you to bear it in mind, that those don't appear to be evidentially based planning points. They appear to be understandable political points, but they don't really justify dropping the number from 2,500 to 1,500. And we'll come back to consider all different ways in which the 2,500 figure is the one which actually is underlain by all the evidence, supported by all the evidence, as Mr. Tustin has said. So I just wanted to drop that in the alternative sessions.
Okay, well, I'll let the council respond in a minute, but I mean, I suppose the point you make there is sustainability appraisal is a tool to help inform ultimately political judgments about a plan and what it proposes. Essays don't usually have a kind of a weighted scoring system of adding up greens and oranges and reds and things. I mean, they can do, but I mean, it's there as to present a picture and to look at, where there may be benefits, maybe disbenefits, whatever. And is it not legitimate for the council to make a political judgment based on that knowledge and that assessment about what it considers most important in this particular case? And is it right to say that it's not evidenced? It's got that information before it. It's just coming to a different judgment rather than.
I'm not sure it is, sir, to be fair. I think that one has to follow what the process is in the NPPF and the PPG. So it's got to be sound. And those are planning tests. And that's exactly the way that 99.9% of the essay and the reasoning procedures by the council works. So it's all about what would be an effective overall strategic site. It's not about whether, and we don't know any of the detail, the idea of 2,500 is too much because of a local political response or pressure. And that I'm not suggesting, sir, that may not be something that the council in its wider capacity can take into account. But it's not something which really goes to soundness, to the test that the soundness and effectiveness of the plan that you're examining. I mean, for instance, there could be a sound plan subject to modifications, which in the end, under the 2004 Act, the council just can't bear politically and decides not to adopt. And that's up to it, obviously, at the end of the process. But that's not the same as whether the plan is sound at 1,500 rather than 2,500.
Okay. Well, that's the issue, isn't it, for me? It's not whether 2,500 would be better. It's whether 1,500 is sound.
Absolutely.
And whether that is an appropriate strategy.
Yes.
Not whether there is another appropriate strategy or a better.
No, absolutely not. So you're quite right. It's all about soundness and whether the number has dropped for a reason which is extraneous to soundness, and whether when you look at all the evidence, actually it all points to 2,500 or at least 2,000 and not 1,500. So not having 2 or 2,500 is unsound. Exactly, that's the question that you're being asked.
Well, the question is 1,500 sound, not whether 2,500 would be more sound or better.
Yes, absolutely. So I put it the other way around. But of course, I totally agree. That's comes through, I hope, from the representations that we've made, that we think that it's unjustified, ineffective, unsound. And the only place where you can really get your fingers behind why the change is made is this bit in the SA.
Yeah, okay.
So I start
But it's not the change that concerns me, is it? It's the 1,500. Unless you're saying procedurally something's gone wrong, I'm looking at the 1,500 and I'm going to look at, I've got 17 issues under this matter.
Yes.
And when I've looked at all of those, I can make a judgment about whether the 1,500 in the plan period, which is what the policy says,
yes,
is sound.
Of course, and I'm not suggesting anything different from that. All I'm saying is when you're judging whether the 1,500 is sound or not, you have to look at the evidence, obviously. All the evidence is there in support of 2,500, not 1,500. And if you do drop by 1,000, then as we'll come to, there are questions about infrastructure, about the school, about viability and so on. And those all feed back into whether 1,500 is sound or not.
Absolutely.
So the number should be high.
Good, okay, thank you. Right. Thatcham Town Council, your signs are still up, but that's fine. Okay, let's come back to the council, and if we could, in terms of, do you want to just explain the essay process, when it started and how it related to the Thatcham growth study, and also what the essay tells us about the decision to change from 2,500 to 1,500?
So in terms of the process to getting to where we are now, the SEA is an iterative process. It started at the beginning. We consulted on the scope of that in February 2018, and then work was ongoing between then and the submission of the plan to update that, look at options and all of those things. And that looked at the spatial strategy. And once that had decided to look at options for strategic development in Thatcham, the council commissioned the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study to take place. And while that was going on, discussions were still going on about what options could be taken forward. The HELA was going on, the site assessment work was going on. The Thatcham Strategic Growth Study was set into 3 different stages. The first stage looked at Thatcham historically, the second stage looked at Thatcham currently, and the third stage then took the recommendation of the Stage 2 report to take forward the strategic site at North East Thatcham. But the essay work was going on alongside that as part of that work. So at Reg 18, the consultation in December 2020, that included the proposal of the site at North East Thatcham, and that was included in the essay. That I think at that stage, it didn't necessarily explain quite the process behind that in the essay. That's why that's been updated in the subsequent essay to set out the different options that were considered through the work the growth study did. So that's kind of where we've got to with that.
Just on that then, so in terms of the Reg 18 plan in December 2020, that included the Thatcham, North East Thatcham site based on 2,500, and that was emerging from the growth study and the essay that had been going on by then for over 2 years. That started at the beginning of the plan making process in February 2018. Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Fine. Okay, which then maybe brings us on to the next sequence of events when it moves from the 2,500 to the 1,500, what the essay gives evidence for or tells us about that.
So obviously following that Reg 18 consultation in December 2020, a significant number of comments were received on the whole plan, but specifically on the proposed policy for North East Thatcham. And the decision was made by the council that to reduce the number on the site in response to the number of comments that were received from members of the public about that being too much development in the area. So it is as a response to that consultation. The essay sets that out, that is the approach that was taken by the council.
So in terms of what was said by the partnership about the judgment of the council, that it was in response to the public concerns that are raised about the scale of the development, the essay used the same systematic and consistent approach in terms of the criteria and the objectives and the scoring system, and that so the decision was made before was it the council's decision, the political decision, was it made before the sustainability appraisal had been done and used by the council, or was it the other way around, i.e. once the council had made that political judgment based on the objections, it you used the appraisal to compare the two.
The discussion went on about reducing the numbers in response to that consultation, and the essay was then done at the same time to help at least highlight what potential issues there might be, or just to highlight the difference between those two schemes. If it was at 1,500, this is what the essay says. At 2,500, this is what the essay said, and just to help inform that decision.
And the main differences that the essay found between the two scales of development are, do you want to just briefly summarise what the essay said? I mean, there's other evidence presumably that was also taken into account by the council, but the essay basically identified what has been the main things.
So in terms of the higher number, the scheme, they both score positively on the essay. They both will deliver community benefits and therefore have a positive impact on social sustainability. The environmental sustainability impacts are potentially less with a smaller scheme because there isn't the quantum of development going on the site, and therefore potentially more opportunity for open space and things like that. Obviously, the impact on the economy, a bigger site takes longer to build, therefore potentially slightly more positive impact, but it's not significantly different. The main difference not picked up by the essay is just in terms of the quantum of infrastructure to be delivered on the site. Obviously, the development needs to meet the needs of the development. So with a bigger number on the site, you would get more infrastructure provision. That the essay notes that will potentially be less with a fewer number on the site, but it doesn't quantify what what infrastructure would be different on the site. It just makes the note that there is less scope for certain things, but the development is still required to meet the needs of the development in terms of its infrastructure provision.
Okay, so your position is that the essay and the other information that the council had in terms of the growth study and the HELO assessments and all those sort of things, and the various transport studies and things we'll come on to, landscape studies, it had enough information to make a reasonable informed judgment about the scale of the development it wanted on this strategic site, and it was a political judgment to make 1,500 as being something, whereas previously the 2,500 it had tested it out, it had seen the public reaction and made a decision that it would go for something a bit less, but which the essay and other evidence suggested could still deliver benefits and there would be a positive.
That's correct. We were still looking for a strategic site and considered that 1,500 would still provide that strategic level of support.
Right, thank you for that. I think that picks up the main concerns raised, unless, Councillor Reid.
So if I could just, on the discussion around when the political decision was made, I think prior to my time as being a councillor, but the council did delegate that the decision could be made then by officers on the submission to the to the inspectorate, the actual plan itself. I would say actually the groundswell of political and also local residents' feelings about the development was strongly against the administration at the time, and they knew that, and hence that delegation to the officers, I think, was inappropriate and rushed, and it should have gone back to the administration again to allow a political decision whether North East Action was appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Right. Unless there's anything else the council wishes to say before we move on, I'm just going to deal with the second issue, which is the reference in the plan to the West Berkshire strategic vision. So this is something that the council has proposed as a modification to refer to this document. Right, okay. So the reason justification is to refer to a document that exists. It's in the evidence library. And the issue here was around the NPPF, and it's talking about having a long-term vision beyond the plan period. This is NPPF paragraph 22, yeah. But again, it's about the sequence of timing, I suppose. It's about this, why was this strategic vision commissioned when it was, which was after the Reg 18 consultation, which had already put forward this site in this part of the district. Do you want to just respond to that?
Yeah, so the visioning work was commissioned in response to the change in the NPPF in July 2021, which was after Reg 18 consultation, because that was December 2020. So that's why it was commissioned when it was. So it does consider the plan at Reg 18. It looks at those things, but it sets out the strategic vision for how strategic sites should be delivered. It doesn't sort of limit that to just North East Thatcham. It's a vision to 2050. So it's looking much further ahead, and the sort of principles within that vision could be used for the sites as they are now, but also for sites within in the future that would be considered in any future local plan.
Okay, so it was a response to government policy having changed. You thought, well, okay, if that's what national policy now asks us to do, let's think about where we've got to in this Reg 18 plan and look at that longer term vision and check to see again how it fits. But it was more about the how rather than the whether, because the national policy already encouraged or described large-scale strategic extension to distant towns as being an option to delivering, significant growth, has been a sensible option in some cases. So that policy was already there. This was more about, well, it's now asking us to set such a development in a longer-term view. We'll look at it, and that was what the council did. So some could say a positive response to national policy changing. Others could say, well, a retrospective sitting of something to fit a plan that had already been half prepared. So, whichever way. However, in terms of this policy, just to be clear, SP 17 proposes 1,500 homes during the plan period, as we've heard. I asked a question about whether the council expects that to be the end of it, or but that is just during the plan period. And I think that your position was, well, no, that's what the policy is proposing, and that's it. I suppose you can never say never, because a plan can be reviewed and you could look at it again, but we can look at what the way this site is now being proposed for development and what that would mean for any longer term visions of growth. So in that respect, why is this West Berkshire Strategic Vision 2050 relevant to this site, if this site is to be something delivered just within the plan period?
It's still a strategic site that is, looking over a 15-year period of the plan. And it sets out principles for development and what they should do and how they should to develop, which are relevant to this site as it is a strategic site coming forward. The plan period is now proposed to go to 2041, and the vision is up to 2050. So you've got a 10-year period at the end that's different, but it still sets out the vision. It's still a long build out time that the site would have, and therefore still fits within that strategy.
Okay. So the reference, I'm just reading the words now, the West Berkshire Strategic Vision 2050 offers a clear spatial steer as to where growth in Newbury and Thatcham might go over the longer term period up to 2050. So is that talking about the two strategic sites in the plan, i.e. this one and Sandalford Park, the clear spatial steer, i.e. it refers to those locations? Or is it saying something about longer term period up to 2050 over and beyond those two developments?
It does sort of consider where development could go beyond that as well. There's a map on page 22 of the vision that looks at areas sort of identified for potential future growth beyond the two sites that are currently allocated.
Okay, so the council position is it does provide that broader context. These two sites are consistent with it, they fall within it, they're taking account of it, but it's setting out how they should be developed and also potentially what the longer term view may be. Okay, thank you, that's clear enough. Right, Bucklebury.
Thank you, sir. I think our position is that it doesn't provide the kind of certainty that's required here. And I think really the fact is it was done at the time, and we accept that, but it is already out of date as a document. One reference, and this is just a particular reference, page 75 has the timings for applications and submission of an outline application in spring 2023. So accept things have moved on already, but you have a document that's being referred to in a policy that's already got things that are out of date. Equally, it says that the actual quantum of development is yet to be agreed, and that would be done as part of Reg 19. So there's a number of points within this document that we say would at the very least need updating to bring it into line with what SP 17 is saying. In its current form, it's simply not a document that would be effective and has a place within this policy.
Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So our view is that the reference to this would make the plan less sound. I shall explain why. So firstly, you will have seen our Regulation 19 representations that show the shortcomings in the evidence base that we only found out about this document by accident. We took a lot of trouble to make comments, and those were not incorporated into the evidence base, which, among other things, says that Thatcham is 3 kilometres west of Newbury, which is a fairly fundamental mistake. But the reason why it's unsound, so firstly, the NPPF says that the wording was that the policy should be set within a vision. In other words, the vision should take the lead and the policy should flow from it, and not the other way around, which is, as you've described, what happened in this case. There is no connection between the policies and the content of the vision. Of course, because the vision, although it was part of the evidence base, was rather in limbo because it wasn't referenced, people would not have chosen to comment on it in the limited time available, except for Thatcham Town Council, which had a great deal of past evidence that we wish to contain. But the key point is that it in fact contradicts the local plan in some key respects. So paragraph 914 of the vision document says, taking a cautious assumption of delivery of 160 units per annum, circa 1,800 homes might be delivered over the planned period to 2039, and the development could be expected to be completed by 2043 to 44. And that is in contrast to what you quoted before, sir, which is the site is to be allocated for approximately 1,500 dwellings, which will be completed within the planned period. Also, the council referred to a map on page, I think they said page 22. I'd like to draw your attention to a different map on page 69, which shows potential areas for future growth, which are shaded. Those include the areas that would be identified within the site SP 17 for Country Park and various other places, and indeed it includes an area shaded which extends into Hampshire. So I think that is a contradictory to the local plan, and therefore, and in fact, as I say, that the vast majority of this document is platitudes that could apply to any local plan anywhere in the country. There is very little which is specific to Thatcham, almost nothing which is specific to the period after the current local plan. It does not add value, but it adds contradiction. Thank you, sir.
And everyone that, I'm examining the detailed words in this plan. The modification is as simple, it's not in the policy, so it's not giving it any status as policy. It's just a reference in the reason justification. And it seems to me it's a factual reference because it's a document that exists. The council prepared this document, and it says it offers a clear spatial steer as to where growth in Newbury and Thatcham may go beyond over the longer period. So if anyone's got an objection, it's to those detailed wording rather than the existence. I'm not examining that document. It is what it is.
But it certainly doesn't provide anything that's clear, let alone a spatial steer, because the spatial information it contains is contradictory to things that would have been settled in the current local plan period and which wouldn't be available. Thank you.
So I can look at these detailed wordings, and if I think, for the reasons you've explained, that it does not provide a clear spatial steer, I could, decide how it should be altered. Indeed, it isn't in the submitted plan, so I could make the view, well, it isn't essential for soundness to modify the plan to revert to it anyway. So leave it with me.
I think that our concern is that if there is contradictory information, this is information which will be used by developers, even if it's not part of the plan, it will be part of the argumentation and therefore undermine the clear statements made in the plan, in the policy itself.
Yeah, understood. And obviously, I'm going to look in detail as I've hit all these different aspects of it and what that means for the actual. And if there are, if it does introduce ambiguity about longer term spatial steer for where growth could be, i.e. in areas that this plan is actually saying it's now protecting as green infrastructure, well, you know, maybe there is an issue to sort of say it's not particularly helpful. Yeah, North East Thatcham Partnership.
Thank you. So our point on this is kind of the other side of the same coin, if you like. So we agree, first of all, with the council on the answer to the actual question that you asked, which is should reference be made in the document to the strategic vision to 2050? Yes, it should be. And the answer, the reason for that is principally paragraph 22 of the NPPF, as it now is. So I'm giving the current NPPF paragraph numbers. That's the one which talks about what strategic policies like this one should do. So minimum 15 to anticipate and respond to long-term requirements and opportunities such as those arising from major improvements in infrastructure, where larger developments such as new settlements or significant extensions, which is what we're dealing with, policies should set a vision that looks further ahead to take account of likely timescale for delivery. That's exactly why it's right to refer to the document. But it's not a question of it being inconsistent and therefore this document should come out, sir. The point is that this is one of the many documents which supports the 2,500. And that's why there is a tension between the 1,500, which isn't justified. And so just for your note, very briefly, pages 32 and 76 of that document are the really important ones. That's where you get, and 32, the wrapping up of all the reasons, all the planning reasons why 2,500 is right, page 32. And page 76 is the point about looking beyond the plan period. If you're having a big strategic development here, housing need doesn't stop at the end of the plan period, but you're looking ahead to the 2040s. And it's all of a piece. The one thing that's out of step is the drop to 1,500.
Okay, well, it is an issue that I'll come back to when we've been through all these different aspects of this site and what I conclude about that, and then I suppose that will help determine whether the wording in this paragraph that has been introduced is appropriate or not in terms of how it relates to what the plan actually is going to propose as I modify it. Does the council just want to say anything in response to what it's heard there about these apparent, things have moved on and there's some specific things that are shown and mentioned in that vision document that now appear to be contradictory, and therefore isn't it unhelpful rather than helpful?
I don't think we'd say it's contradictory. Yes, things have moved on. It's a document that was dated November 2022, so you'd expect things to have changed. The principles of it and how a site should be developed are not specific necessarily to the site at North East Thatcham. They are general principles for development over the 30-year period it's looking at, and therefore they are still relevant to this site and any others that are going to come forward by putting out those bases. And in terms of the sort of strategic growth or growth opportunities for going forward, yes, it puts some dots on a map. There are places that can be considered. They're not necessarily taken that they are going to be places for development in the future. That is a whole nother set of work that would need to be done through either a review of this plan or a future local plan.
You've mentioned twice now about it setting clear principles for the way in which the site should be developed. The wording that you've suggested be added to paragraph 6.54 doesn't mention that. It mentions what it does say, it provides a clear spatial steer, which to me implies that it sets broad locations for where Newbury and Thatcham will expand in the longer term, including on these sites and elsewhere beyond the plan period. So if you're saying actually what its main role is not that, well, maybe that is one of its roles, but its role is to set out these principles. Well, aren't those principles, if they're right, shouldn't they be reflected in the words of SP17 rather than relying on some principles that are set out in another document?
And they are taken into account in the wording of policy SP17. So yeah, the the vision does do both. It gives that steer for where strategic development can go, which includes this site, but then also sets out strategic objectives and growth principles, but they are taken into account in the requirements of the policy.
Okay, so you don't need to read that document to implement policy SP17.
No.
Right. Okay. We'll come on to the Thatcher and Grove study later because I think I've dealt with that yet under master planning and because you do say that that document includes guiding principles that continue to remain relevant. So I think what you're saying is about the vision document, you don't need to read it to implement policy SP17. It's part there of a longer term justification. Thatcher and Grove study, which we'll come on to later, is slightly different because there are some principles in there which provide a bit more detail potentially than in policy SP17 that would potentially feed into the master planning process, which we'll deal with later. Yep.
Yes, that's correct.
Understood. Right. Mr. Pike, your sign is up again. Good. Okay. If you keep doing this, I'm going to ignore you when your sign's up. You say, so what's it? Yeah, you cry wolf too many times. Right. Okay. I think it is 11 o'clock now. We've dealt with one item on the agenda, or two, I suppose, if we're being generous, 2 questions, and 3 actually, if we're talking about AP1 as well. So we're not doing bad. Let's have a break now, and we'll come back after at 11:20 if we could. And we're going to look at the various questions about infrastructure. So we'll start with transport, and we've got education, health, and community infrastructure. So we'll break now and resume at 11:20, please. Thank you.
Okay, it is 11:20, so we'll resume. Just before I move on to issue 4.2, which is about, 4.3 actually, with transport infrastructure. Two things. One, I think Mr. Pike wishes to raise a question, and then I've got a certain individual who has got some points that he wish to make, and I understand I've got to leave before lunch or around lunchtime, so I'll deal with that.
Thank you, sir. So apologies that I didn't find the relevant document before the break relating to the vision. Just to draw your attention to Appendix 8 of the Thatcham Town Council Regulation 19 consultation, which is the specification written by West Berkshire Council for the work, and in particular the paragraph 4.2, which says that the vision must also align with the wider vision already outlined in the emerging draft version of the LPR and reflect and support the policy document, direction of that document, which seems to be the opposite of what is the intention of NPPF. So that's paragraph 4.2 of Appendix 8 of the Thatcham Town Council Regulation 19 consultation. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Right, Mr. Ember. Now, I understand you got in touch with the programme officer either yesterday or this morning, I can't remember, asking to appear today. I've read your Regulation 19 representation. I can look at it again, so you don't need to read that out to me. But I understand you do need to leave. So if there's any brief points you just wish to bring to my attention now about any of the items on the agenda, do so. But don't feel you need to deal with stuff that's written down, or if there's something particularly you wish to.
Okay, so as long as that's covered, and I didn't really realise the extent to which that would be considered. So my comments related to the were made about a year ago, related to the LPR. And as a local resident, I felt I should come down at least and listen to the discussion today. Most of my comments relate to environmental and biodiversity issues. The development is 2 square miles of beautiful south-facing farmland, and indeed it would be a good location for a solar farm, but it's got lots of ponds and abundant wildlife, and it's adjacent to the AONB. So my comments really related to that, and I felt the LPR didn't have a proper biodiversity net gain plan to it, and I felt it was inconsistent with the national policy framework. In fact, specifically section 15, page 50, for protecting and enhancing landscapes, biodiversity and soils, and recognising the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. There was no real reference to an ecological and biodiversity buffer zone and corridors around the site. And indeed, it seems to me it was an inconsistencies amongst how large the site would actually occupy, given that it was either 1,500 or 2,500 homes. There's also no reference within the LPR for any no consideration of climate change or net zero carbon reporting, i.e. emissions during the construction from the brick and the concrete and the steel, and also the actual construction materials, which would actually amount to hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon equivalent. And there wasn't really enough within WBC's own core strategy to maximise the use of brownfield land and access to facilities and services. Now, things might have moved forward since then, but that was the situation last year. And also Lord Deben, who was the chairman of the Independent Committee on Climate Change last year, said that all planning laws should be made to consider climate and sustainability in mind. And this one didn't seem to do that at all, or very little. Adjacent to the site, apart from the AONB, is Bucklebury Common. There were 2 woodland fires on Bucklebury Common in 2015 through people setting barbecues down on tinder dry land. And I think with adding another 4,000 people there, 4 to 6,000 people, 1,500 homes, you'd increase the risk of woodland fires, and I'm not sure what provision had been made with the fire department for planning in that regard. At the time, there were no real reasonable alternatives to the site, and we also felt that well, there are other uses that you could put the site to. For instance, a solar farm which would have less biodiversity impact would have, and we could put electricity back into the grid. And there's no discussion within the LPR detailing how it would limit further residential sprawl and urban sprawl down the A4 towards Reading. Or maybe that's part of the plan, further growth. And then finally, consideration of surface runoff down. The whole thing is on the banks of a hillside, and the surface runoff down into Kennet Valley would be managed. So those were my points, really.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's useful to get local residents' views on this. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of representations about this plan and you know, concerns raised. Most of those things that you've mentioned, we are going to look at in detail, both over the course of the rest of today in relation to this site and tomorrow on the agenda items you've seen. I mean, you're probably aware, but this event is being broadcast on YouTube. If you wish to look at some of the further discussions about some of those, for example, what you mentioned about the landscape and biodiversity coming up later today under issues 4.7, 4.12. So if you do want to, you know, have a look at that either live today, I think also it is available to view afterwards as well. So you can spend your leisure time in catching up on what you've missed out on. Anyway, thank you for that contribution.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Right, and feel free to leave whenever you want. Okay, so can we now then move on to the infrastructure? Just a reminder that national policy expects strategic policies to make sufficient provision for infrastructure and community facilities. And but it goes on to recognise that where local plans propose large-scale developments, including significant extensions to towns, there may not be certainty and/or funding secured for necessary strategic infrastructure at the time the plan is produced. So in those circumstances, the strategic policymaking authorities, such as the council, are expected to demonstrate that there is a reasonable prospect that the proposals can be developed within the timescales envisaged following engagement with infrastructure providers. And I know we've got some infrastructure providers here today. We've also got other representations from other infrastructure providers that we will talk about. So I just wanted to set that context, because while some may look for certainty about funding and exactly what will be delivered when, you know, the national policy does recognise that that is not always possible when a long-term plan is being produced. It's looking ahead 15 years or so. So I just wanted to make that clear by way of context. So what I'm going to do now is move on to transport infrastructure first, but we have got other important elements of infrastructure that the policy proposes I'll come on to after that. So on transport, the transport system has been carried out and further work has been done, and I'm just going to look at that again briefly shortly. But anyway, the transport assessment that the council carried out during the preparation of the plan found that the development on this site could cause additional delays and congestion around key junctions along the A4 corridor, consequently leading to through traffic diverting onto unsuitable alternative routes. And we'll come on to some of what those may be shortly. So to address this, the assessment identifies a package of measures to encourage a shift towards sustainable modes, along with that's to try and reduce the amount of traffic that would otherwise be generated, along with improvements to highway capacity in key junctions on the A4 corridor and Floral Way to address the existing and worsening problems that could arise. So that's the basic background to that. We discussed under matter 3 the ongoing work with National Highways to assess the potential impact of development at Thatcham on, well, not just Thatcham, but Thatcham as part of the wider package of development,
on junction 13 of the M4. And then your response to, and there was a statement of common ground that we discussed in week 1, which referred to some further work that had been carried out and also ongoing review of that work by National Highways. So helpfully, in response to my action point 3, last week, you provided some further update on that and provided the updated transport assessment by WSP, who are here today. So that we can look at that as necessary. But the note that you've done in response to AP3 in relation to National Highways, who have not chosen to be here, I'll read it out and then I'm going to ask you what exactly this means. You say that the M4 junction 13 modelling currently represents not just a worst case scenario, but an overly worst case scenario, which suggests there could be queuing in 5 to 10 years' time. That's at that motorway junction, presumably, yeah. National Highways have asked for new surveys and new modelling to be undertaken to robustly inform the need, if any, for mitigation to facilitate West Berkshire local plan growth. And this further work will inform the next steps of the ongoing liaison and assessment work with the National Highway, between the Council and National Highways. And this will feed into future updates of the infrastructure delivery plan where necessary. So reading what that means is National Highways still want some further work carrying on around the impacts of development that this plan is proposing on the M4 junction 13. They're not quite satisfied yet that the development proposed will not require further mitigation. Is that correct?
In a sense, yes. It's not so much about the proposed developments from the local plan. It's about what kind of growth is predicted and the impacts just in the reference case. So it's not necessarily about the local plan development impacts. What they're saying is that the modelling is showing that they think it's showing an overly worst case, partly due to the fact that there's a signalised junction which is only called in, I think it's a depot access, only called in every so many cycles on demand, but you can't reflect that in a Linsig model. It's just a flat assignment and it's called every cycle. So I think we just overestimated the impacts of potential queuing even in the reference case. And obviously with the growth being from the 2017 base year model, they just want to be sure that, you know, they don't consider that those impacts will really materialise that bad in 5-10 years time. So in doing additional new surveys, it will just be a very, very up-to-date junction assessment, potentially removing, you know, not having that depot called every cycle, just to satisfy themselves of what they actually might look like in the future. But they're still satisfied with what the local plan impacts are showing, and they're comfortable that the council can work through that.
Okay, so rather than thinking you've underestimated the impacts, their concern is that you've overstated the potential impacts.
That's correct.
Right. And their concern, if they have one about that, is what?
I think it's a concern about moving forwards. They might be saying that, you know, they're not suggesting even any mitigation is needed at this stage based on the modelling, but they just want to be sure that the junction assessment is as robust as possible, because they expect that it's not going to be as much queuing at that junction as the modelling is showing, even in the reference case.
So the plan as proposed doesn't include any mitigation at M4 junction 13, does it? No, it's only on the local road network. There's certain things. Yeah, okay. And there's nothing factored into the IDP.
Not as far as I'm aware.
Well, sorry, not in relation to the proposal of the development in the plan.
No.
Okay, so but they want to continually model and survey, which presumably would be that ongoing anyway, would it? I mean, is that not normal practice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just putting a marker down that whilst the worst case scenario that you've identified does suggest that there may be some mitigation.
They're not, they don't think necessarily looking at it, there'll be mitigation required.
Right.
It does just show increased queuing as you'd expect over a number of years from the base year. It's not about the impacts of the local plan. It's the reference case that's sort of showing, you know, increased congestion compared to the Berkshire, which is to be expected. And they're just going to be sure that the model is showing a really accurate as possible reflection of the growth in the future.
Okay, so I don't need to be concerned that the deliverability of this site is in any way, the evidence indicates is in any way affected by expensive works that would be required at that motorway junction, based on the evidence that you've done, even on a worst case scenario, and National Highways' view of that.
Yes, National Highways' view is that is not the case.
And with developments such as, if motorway junctions need works, my understanding is that, well, that's a lot to do with existing traffic. In most cases, there may be a trigger that development leads to, you know, something having to be brought forward sooner rather than later, but it's not usually the thing that actually makes that work necessary. So that we're not in a situation here where there is some programmed improvement works that would need to be brought forward. We're not even in that sort of situation.
No.
No. Okay. So you're satisfied, your double SPs, you know, and I'll come on to Mr. Gore as well, just to confirm that National Highway, there's no issue around the deliverability of this site that's going to be affected by more expensive road schemes or road schemes that can't be delivered for, you know, until a future date than the plan assumes, based on, you know, the evidence that you've done.
That's correct, sir. We have regular meetings with National Highways, and I'm sure if they had any substantive concerns, they would have made themselves available to come and speak to you today. The modelling work we're satisfied with, and it was just that one issue of the traffic light phase for the highways depot vehicles getting out, which they don't do that often, and certainly not during rush hours. That the way it was modelled in was making it look worse than it really would have been. So we're satisfied that normal background growth and there'll be no special effect on that junction by the North East Action development.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. It's just reading that paragraph in exam 26 just got me thinking whether there was something here that was being hinted at that could potentially be, you know, a significant impact on this development. But I think what you're telling me is that is not what the evidence shows, and nor is it what National Highways are suggesting. So thank you for that clarification. Which brings me back to the roads in West Berkshire, which the council is the highway authority for, and we dealt with this the other day, but the council is satisfied that the package of developments that are proposed in the plan that won't have a significant impact in terms of capacity, congestion or highway safety, and that the mitigations that are required they're identified in the plan in broad terms, and they've been costed in broad terms through the IDP, and they've been factored into the policy costs of the various policies in the plan. That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, I can confirm that's correct, sir. Yeah, that's submitted.
I'll come on to other views about the transport assessment and the work done by, you know, and alternative views by others. First of all, can I just deal with the level crossing issue at Thatcham? This is the council say this is an existing problem, and it can be a significant problem at times, causing long delays. It's closed for a significant part of the day, causing queues on the roads. Solutions are being investigated. They're expensive, would require external funding. So again, you're not saying that this development or any other developments proposed in the plan are dependent on waiting for a scheme to come forward to do that?
We're not saying that, no. We do recognise that Thatcham Crossing is an issue locally. It's a local commuter route. It does about 9,000 or 10,000 vehicles a day, which is not a huge number. But the cost, there've been studies over the years, in the last 20 years, 3 studies in particular, and the cost of putting in a bridge at that location would be huge, because you'd have other infrastructure works that would need to be done, for instance, on the bends and the incline on Crookham Hill to the south. And the cost for the total package of works has been estimated to be somewhere in the region of 50 to 60 million pounds. That our local MP, Laura Farris, she's recently taken a particular interest in that because of representations made locally. So I did prepare a paper which was submitted to her, and we're waiting a response accordingly. But it's not as simple a solution as just putting up a bridge. That would have to be to a certain spec. The railway infrastructure in terms of the cabling and the supports for that cabling would be affected, as would be the incline of any ramps that you were going to use. So it's not quite a simple solution as it sounds, but I have set out what would be required if we were to do it.
Okay, but leaving that, that is an issue, but it's not an issue. It's not a proposal in the plan. It's not a requirement to be provided in the plan, and it doesn't provide any obstacle to the development that's proposed in the plan going ahead.
That's right, sir.
Yeah, okay, so interesting as it may be, and a concern that it may be, clearly for local people, it's not something that affects this soundness of this plan. And National Network Rail, sorry, they've said that the development could lead to more complaints, longer delays because of the additional traffic. I mean, I don't know whether that's based on the transport assessment or just an assumption that, you know, there's more traffic, more delays, but they're not here. There's not got an outstanding objection to the plan as such that you're aware of.
That's right, sir. And as with National Highways, we also have regular meetings with Network Rail, and they're keen to point out that the current level crossing is the highest level of safety that any crossing can have. In other words, it's got the complete double gates on both sides, and so any cars that try and divert round it doesn't happen. So yeah, that's where we are with that crossing.
Okay, thank you. Right, what I'm going to do now is look at the transport evidence submitted by Thatcham Town Council, the Bucklebury Parish Council, and also Coldash Parish Council, which was submitted along with their Regulation 19 representation. So you've had plenty of time to have a look at that, and I think I put a marker down when we were in week 1 to say that I've got some specific issues about that, because basically that was done. Those bits of work were done as a sort of critique of the transport assessment that had been done and submitted with the plan, Regulation 19, or before that. I don't know exactly the timing of things, but anyway. So there's a number of points I drew out of it as in terms of the main criticisms. So I'll go through those and ask the council to respond to them to make sure I can tick those things off. You may say I've missed something, or you may wish to elaborate on what I've said or what they've said. So bear with me. I'll just go through this list if I could. So the first point is that the sort of the base trip rates taken from the census only include journeys to work, and therefore are unrealistically low. And they should include some other journeys such as travel to school and things like that. So do you want to just respond to this one? And I'll
So the trip generation and distribution was set out in the work done by Transport Planning Associates for the North East Thatcham Consortium. As we understood it, that had been agreed with West Berkshire before we did the modelling. So it wasn't for WSP to change that or suggest changing the rates in any way. It had been agreed with the development control team, as we understand it. In terms of trips, the trip rates are included in the appendix to that note. I think I don't think they've necessarily gone into too much detail about how everything's been calculated to get to the final trip volumes that are input to the modelling. But it was just something that was agreed with West Berkshire before WSP did the modelling.
I mean, the basic point is that they are unrealistically low because they only include journey to work. Do they only include journey to work factually?
I think that's the point. Yeah, I think so.
So are they realistic? Are they reasonable? Or are they on the low side?
Didn't think they were unrealistic, and the West Berkshire's development control team didn't think they were unrealistic. I couldn't answer for TPA, but one could assume that maybe they have compared the tricks household generation trip rates, which would include any other trip purposes. They may have done that comparison and decided that it was okay to move forward with that, but sorry, that wasn't shared with WSP at the time.
Okay, so I'm left there with, yes, they may be on the low side because they include journey to work. You can't tell me otherwise, so fair enough. Okay, the trip rates, the base trip rates were then discounted 25%, I think, for assumptions about use of buses So these trip rates would have been normal households using cars for journey to work. and
Yes,
then-
it's not a 25% reduction, just to
Right,
clarify.
Okay, yeah. But sorry, explain a minute, but they made a reduction on the trip rates based on the use of buses by future residents walking and cycling. Is that right?
That was a subsequent decision taken between WSP and West Berkshire based on potential demand mitigation measures that could be implemented with a travel plan, for example. That wasn't in the TPA note.
Sorry, so when you say they're not discounted by 25%, what? Can you just explain what the difference
So
is?
what was done, WSP took the trip generation provided by Transport Planning Associates, which didn't account for it accounted for internalisation of trips, but didn't account for the demand mitigation, demand reduction that could be caused by providing a travel plan. And it's, as we understand it, West Berkshire said they would be required to provide a travel plan with the development. So we had discussions, we used existing studies, tools such as the DFT propensity cycle tool, where active travel plans have been implemented and successful, looked at lots of research and talked to WSP's future mobility team about what potential switch out of cars could we expect if such measures were in place, which would include any active travel improvements and a bus service, which is expected to be provided with the development just between the site and Thatcham Town Centre. So there were sort of two steps to do the demand mitigation. One was applying a 5% reduction in car traffic only to journeys less than 10 kilometres. That was for the active travel measures. So you could say, well, journeys which could be made by walking or cycling, if such measures were in place, this is the amount of switch that could be expected. So that reduction was applied, and separately to do with a potential bus service, we looked at the catchment area, the trips that would be within 800 metres, I think it was, of a bus stop, and only trips that were going to or from Thatcham Town Centre or the rail station, and applied the 20% reduction only on those trips. So it wasn't on all trips from the site, and it wasn't a 25% across everything.
No.
That's those steps.
So those reductions were made. They weren't 25% in total across all trips. They were a reduction on certain of the trips, defined as you have said. But they are factored into the ultimate impact. Well, they're factored in along with other mitigations, and therefore the bottom line of the impacts. Assume that those will be effective through the travel planning and.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of travel planning experience, what you're saying is it's from other developments in West Berkshire. Has any monitoring been done about the sort of effectiveness of those sort of?
Going back to when we did the study, I'm not sure if it was all, I don't think it was all West Berkshire studies. We looked at, everywhere we had some monitoring that had been done and where they, what kind of switch out of cars had been seen. So it was based on existing studies.
So those figures were based on effects of monitoring of travel plans that had been.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right. Understood. Right. In terms of the assumptions made about the use of bikes, the A4 carries a lot of traffic, and the DFT guidance says that. Well, sorry. The point made was the A4 carries around 20,000 vehicles each way per day. And DFT guidance says that more than 6,000 will deter most potential cyclists. And the A4 has intermittent, non-segregated cycle lanes, and it's narrowing in places to make significant improvements. So in that context, are the assumptions about use of cycling realistic? And where would when you factored in the cycling that could take place, is it mainly across the A4 towards the town centre and the railway station rather than along the A4, or is it not?
It was within a 10-kilometre distance. It wasn't purely trips travelling along the A4. It was just within a.
So where would those trips be likely to be going?
Wherever, just within the 10. I can't remember off the top of my head where the destinations are of the trips that we've got in the site. But there will be some that maybe go out north or east or west or south. So the 10-kilometre buffer was just considered as a a factor to apply a reduction.
Okay, so you looked at the journeys that are currently made within a 10 kilometre to whatever destinations they were going to.
Yes, so that was, it was journeys that are within the sort of the reference case model as well as the site itself.
Yeah.
Just with the local plan in place.
And in terms of what the proposals for mitigation, which we'll go on to later, but they include cycle links and walking links. So where would the priorities be for this site? Would it be to get people across the A4 onto existing cycling and walking routes towards the town centre and the railway station? Or is it not just that, it's other things as well?
So yes, this would be to get people onto the existing cycleway, which starts at Flora Way going into the town. But it would also be to provide the same facilities on going out as far as Gables Way, which I understand from the developers would be one of the main entrances to the site. When the mitigation packages, I know you're going to consider those later, but we're also looking at having those make it easier for people to cross from the new residential area into employment areas south of the A4 in Colthrop as well. So that was taken into account in the modification of the junctions as well.
So in simple terms, there'd be cycle routes within the development that would cross the A4 at some point through some sort of signalised crossing, if it doesn't already exist, into the industrial estate as one of the potential routes for people to use.
Yeah, and lessening the separation, the segregation that might otherwise exist.
So that would be one. Would there be another one somewhere further along going west along the A4 or it's mentioned on Floral Way, linking into there's already a cycle route there that connects down into the town, is there?
There's a mention of a signalised junction at Colthrop, which would provide for a crossing point.
At that end, yeah. That's at the east there. What about
That's
further?
in the middle, Colthrop.
Oh, in the middle, sorry. Okay. And elsewhere across the A4? That would
There'd be a formalised crossing at Piper's Way at the proposed signal junction there.
Right, okay. Okay, thank you. Right. There's reference to the development at Colthrop Industrial Estate requiring a TRO preventing right turns. Has that been implemented? I seem to recall seeing that when I drove out of that junction. Yes, you're nodding. Does that have any impact on the modelling that was done?
So I think that was missed in the modelling as didn't pick up on the fact that the right turn might be banned. But looking at the flows out of that junction, it's less than one vehicle every 2 minutes that might need to right turn and therefore use the Gables Way junction. We don't envisage that would be have much of an impact, particularly in the strategic model. It could obviously be factored into the junction model further down the line if you just want to check that impact.
Okay, thank you. Right. Now, in terms of the overall assessment and where drivers may divert to, there's two Google Map provided by one of the alternatives, I can't remember which one, which basically showed, well, if you were going to travel from this location to either M4 junction 13 or M4 junction 12, so that's at Cheveley and Thiel, I think. If you put it into Google Maps at a busy time, it would take you on the local roads going north and around through Bucklebury or Calderdash and off in those directions rather than along the street, the main roads, the A4, etc. So could you just respond to that point?
Yep. Just on the route itself and sort of time of day. So I assume the images were taken at that time of day, whatever time that they looked at the map might have been peak hour. So it gives you a more sort of specific time to say this is how long it would take in minutes now. Having looked at a typical day, I would note that I think some of those plots were done in a half term, so it might have been slightly quieter on those roads at the time. But looking at a typical day, so this morning, for example, it gives you a range. It's sort of, orange in scale. It says between 14 and 24 minutes on either route, going either via the Upper Bucklebury Broad Lane route or the A4. In terms of what route people might take, they don't necessarily consider that a route might be 30 seconds quicker if it's not their familiar route. They they might not know in their heads that it's actually quicker to go one way than another if it's a small amount, a small difference. But just in terms of the points that the routes are taken from, if the route in Google Maps is taken from Flora Way, that to go via the A4, they'd have to go through that stretch between Flora Way and Gables Way, which is the sort of the bit that is being looked to mitigate. Whereas in, the proposed route through the site that comes out onto Gables Way, that would be the route where you'd come out of the development. So you'd either come out of the development up onto Hartshill Road or down onto Gables Way and miss out a chunk of that sort of existing congestion. So we're just sort of saying that, it's not necessarily the quickest route because it's been taken from Flora Way.
I think I understand that. Yeah, that it can only be a picture based on the road network that exists now.
It is,
and an
yeah.
assumption where you started
Yeah.
from. Whereas when you've got these new roads connecting into the network at different points, it could be different.
It's a
That's
different
basically-
picture.
So
And
you don't see there's any significant contradiction
No,
between those.
and
sort
the
of
model
facts?
isn't showing that the A4 is the quickest route from the development. The model is reflecting what may be expected. It is, Broad Lane will have some traffic on it because it is saying that there is it is a route that's viable, but it's not necessarily the quickest route out of the development.
But given that there would be road links onto Hartshill Road, for example, would it not be an obvious point to turn right if you wanted to go up towards junction 13? Wouldn't that be an obvious?
For junction 13, yes, it would be more obvious than coming out onto Gables Way and going through.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if you were going east to Reading, it's not necessarily.
So if you're going to junction 13 at Theald, you wouldn't choose to go that way, probably, you're saying?
13 at Cheveley.
No, Cheveley, 12,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
12, yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, then,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. But those flows were factored into your model anyway, are they?
The flows are in, so the route, how the traffic is loaded into the site is on the specific access points from the junctions that were given to us by Transport Planning Associates.
Yeah.
So they had already done that assessment of which trips, broad distribution of where the trips might be likely to go to in terms of Newbury, Reading, North, broad distributions. That was factored into the expected distribution out of the site. So I think it's a natural assumption that if you're coming from within that development link road, if you were going north, it would be expected that they're going to come out onto the Hartshill Road or Flora Way access and not down onto Gables Way.
So the model does show more traffic on those roads?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't, yeah, okay, so in that sense, yes, it does. But that more traffic on those roads isn't a severe, there wouldn't be a severe impact is what you're saying. So there may be more traffic going through Bucklebury and Caldash, for example.
Correct.
But that would not be severe in terms of congestion, nor would it compromise highway safety.
That's our point. That's what it is.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. Right, there was some, I'm going to open it up for others in a minute to do with what the transport evidence shows about impacts, et cetera. And then I'll look separately at the transport improvements and mitigations that are proposed, the costs and the effectiveness, et cetera. So just on the evidence still, the North East Thatcham Partnership written statement included quite a lot of appendices and additional bits of evidence, which I've not looked at in detail because it is late evidence. But has the council looked at that, and does it tell us anything different to what you've already aware of, or have you not looked at it?
We've only, the modelling that's been done is what was done at the stage when this information was put together. Looking at other scenarios, I have to say from a transport policy modelling perspective, we are in somewhat uncertain times because post-COVID, the times of day at which traffic travels and the morning and the PM peaks are somewhat different. The evening peak is elongated. Morning journeys to work start as early as 4:30, whereas they used to start at 5:30. Looking at the counters that we have in the district for the traffic counts, so things are going to change in the next few years in a way that perhaps none of us can be completely sure of, and you have to draw the line between what is realistic modelling and what would just be, speculation as we aim to get towards carbon neutral. Net zero.
So that's a general point about the modelling. You're saying it's potentially based on a worst case scenario in terms of peak concentrations. Yeah. In terms of the specific question I had about the evidence that was submitted in March this year by the partnership, I think it was by TPA, it's a report. I've seen that there is one. I've not looked at it in any detail. The question was, has the council looked at that or not?
I'm not aware of any further consideration since March, no.
Okay. Right, okay. Well, if they can say briefly what that is and why it was submitted then, or if it tells us anything different. Anything else the council wants to say about what the transport evidence is? We've dealt with national highways, we've dealt with the situation on the West Berkshire roads, and you've dealt with the various points I've picked up from the others there. If not, I'll move on to see. No, okay, thank you. I'll come back to the partnership later, but let's deal with the town council, the parish council. Fine, yeah, okay, right.
Hello, sir. I'd just like to draw your attention to.
Just remind me who.
Sorry, Paul Willis, Yes Engineering, with the transport consultants.
What's engineering, sorry?
Yes.
Yes, engineering, that's right. I did read your report. So you did an assessment of the transport evidence that was available at the time. You've heard that some things have moved on a little bit, but anyway, leaving that aside. And you've heard, I picked up some of the points, hopefully that reflected some of your key concerns.
Some of those I'd obviously like to come back to.
Of course, yeah.
The first point I would like to go to is that the summary of the West Berkshire strategic model, local plan report states general increases in local plan traffic demand through the corridor, as well as TH20 site traffic directly accessing the A4 in this area is likely to cause some displacement onto the wider routes away from the A4 through local villages such as Upper Bucklebury. Now, at this point, sir, no further assessment or modelling or mitigation has been made of that impact through those villages. And within this modelling report, it shows that almost 40% will be heading either eastwards or northwards towards the M4, whether that's towards Cheveley or whether that's towards Reading. That's a huge volume of traffic that will need to go in either of those directions. Now, we heard earlier that we did a review of this, and we did a journey time assessment, both in the school holidays and outside the school holidays. So we get a broad view of that. That clearly shows every day throughout those 2 weeks that the quickest route is through either Bucklebury or through Coldash to get to either of those destinations. Now, I'd like to just point out the statement of common ground that's just been released between Highways England and West Berkshire makes an assessment using Google as the acceptable tool for assessing delay on their latest piece of information. So that clearly shows there's going to be a significant impact there, and none of the modelling shows what the impact's going to be, which is, I would say, remiss at best that this hasn't been considered, where it clearly states through all their reports that these routes are unsuitable. So we don't have any evidence to suggest what the impact is going to be and what is the mitigation for the impact that might well cause. So,
sorry, what sort of assessment would you expect? So if the assessment shows that there would be some diversion, displacement onto the local road network, and some would be going through Coldash, some would through Bucklebury, I think the council would probably say it's quantified. You'd say 40%, and it's a huge increase.
Yes, yeah.
What sort of assessment would you therefore expect it to be?
So the modelling that's been done is purely for the strategic network rather than any of the local assessment. I expect local assessment modelling done of those junctions throughout those areas that are likely to be affected. But no assessment has been made at all as to what the impact's going to be. I mean, these roads are also 60 miles an hour. They have no footways, lighting, etc. Any traffic through there or increase, could be significantly a safety issue. So I would expect some sort of modelling to have been done through these areas, and also an assessment of the route as the very least. But none of that has been presented. Also,
just to make sure I understand it properly. So there would be an assessment of the numbers of additional cars going, or lorries, whatever, and you'd look in detail at the roads through the villages, Coldash, Buckleby or elsewhere, looking at each individual junction at a local assessment, and looking at the nature of the roads and the ways and the widths and all those sort of things.
Yes.
Okay, right. Without that, are you telling me that you don't think it's a reasonable conclusion for the Highway Authority to conclude that the impact will not be severe?
Absolutely. I mean, it just hasn't been assessed. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
I'd then like to move on to, we briefly talked about how the trip rates were generated. And I know this question came up about the 25% reduction. Obviously, that 25% reduction applies to the majority of the sites. And you did ask, has there been any evidence base of how you got to this reduction? Now, I think the easiest way of looking at this is their trip rates are based on Thatcham census data. Thatcham census data will show the same type of amenities that are proposed at this site, and it shows that only 2% of the population use a bus. Now, we're talking about a modal shift of 23% from an area that already has buses, a train station. The train station for the site is not within a recommended walking distance. We talked about cycling. If anyone's been there, the topography and the type of roads, plus the A4 will mean cycling is going to be very, very limited, apart from the very few dedicated ones you might have. But what I would say, and I'm being kind, is the 25% reduction is wildly optimistic. And I don't think you probably need to be a highways engineer to see that the census data will be reflected on the other side of the A4. I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. Overall, as I say, the fundamental point we're trying to get across here is that I don't think the modelling as it stands and the impact of the modelling can be relied upon, because it's unsafe. Things have not been considered. And when we say it's a worst case scenario, I would say from experience, this is very much the best case scenario with the amount of reduction that we're talking about. The other point I would like to make is that, yes, there's mitigation measures along the A4, but they're purely to facilitate the additional traffic caused by 1,500 to 2,500 extra vehicles. So they don't suddenly provide huge amounts of capacity that is then going to take the existing traffic and all the new traffic and suddenly mean that people are not going to divert via Bucklebury or via Coldash. And that's the point. They only just work in 10 years' time, 15 years' time. So to say that everyone is all going to go through the A4 all of a sudden because there's so much more capacity and it's a much easier route, I think is, again, unrealistic, because they've been designed just to work, because that's the nature of highway design.
Okay, thank you. So understood. I think, you two main points I think I'll take from this is, one, you think that the assumptions made in the modelling underestimate the amount of cars that we generate from the site. It also, it does acknowledge that some of that traffic will go through Bucklebury and Coldash, but it hasn't quantified it realistically, but equally importantly, it hasn't assessed the detailed local impacts of that traffic on those roads. Yeah. I'll let the council respond, but as Highway Authority, could I not assume that they've got pretty good knowledge of the local road network? And if they thought there was a potential severe impact, which is the test you'll be aware of, national policy test, or that there would be a highway safety issue, wouldn't the council have been, as Highway Authority, wouldn't it have been aware of that?
I certainly would hope so, but in this case, there's no evidence for me to assess that has actually happened. And perhaps the evidence wasn't given to them about how much traffic is going to go through there. Obviously, there's several consultants that worked on this. I don't know how closely it's happened, but all I can say is the evidence presented does not show that this is a safe and sensible route.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So we didn't conduct our own traffic study, so I just got a couple of observations about other information. So I think as far as the traffic generated by the site, one key thing is the likely provision of a school, which will have a secondary school, which will have much larger capacity than on the site needed by the site itself, which will therefore generate traffic onto the site at the same time as the rush hour. On the active travel, the point I noted you were quoting from our representations. The point we were making was that the guidance, government guidance, is that 6,000 vehicle movements per day is the maximum for which the majority of people will feel, cyclists will feel safe to use a non-segregated cycle lane, and the traffic is at the moment 20,000 movements per day. Therefore, the majority of people living on the future residents on this site would feel it unsafe to use a cycle lane, and certainly some parts of it that have no cycle lane at all because it's impossible to fit one in, and the rest is only non-segregated. So the point there is that the usage is likely to be a lot less than would be calculated by some generic number from a number of locations. As far as the level crossing goes, one factor that hasn't been taken into account is that all planning policies now are trying to encourage people to use public transport, including trains. And in order to do that, there's likely to be an increase in frequency of stopping services. And therefore, a consequence of planning policies indirectly would be an increase in congestion at the level crossing due to more trains and more that stop, because the ones that stop result in the barriers being down for longer. And in response to the question about the 10 kilometres cycle radius for active travel, I have no idea where residents of these sites would go to travelling north into the countryside, apart from perhaps St Finian's Catholic Primary School. That's the only site I can think of that would generate significant travel that doesn't cross the A4 or go towards the station. In fact, there's also a question as to whether it's possible to build a segregated cycle lane to the station as well. I haven't seen any proposals as to how that would be done. So, and buses to Thatcham, I'm not sure what the usage would be as a destination. And of course, if you have to change buses, then that increases the travel time and reduces the propensity to use them as well. So while the concept of a bus service, as long as which may need to be subsidised and therefore a limited duration is desirable, I'm not sure how effective it would be in reducing the usage of cars. Thank you, sir.
Councillor Reid.
Yes, sir. I'd just like to raise my concerns about the modelling as well. As a resident in just outside Upper Bucklebury and a frequent commuter to Basingstoke in the southeast area, I have noticed over the last 5 months, as more and more businesses are saying come back into the office post-COVID, working from home is significantly reduced. There's a lot of concern about productivity, so businesses want them in the office. I've noticed that people are using, for want of a better term, rat runs through Brimpton, through Woolhampton and through Froude's Lane. So if you're coming from the north of the A4, it means a right-hand turn. That means that I've noticed that the central reservations are actually filling and people are queuing now on the A4, which means traffic going east on the A4 is now significantly reduced. And I suspect that modelling has not been, or that effect has not been seen in the modelling.
Okay, thank you. Vincent's Lane.
Thank you, sir. I'm glad you picked up the words overly worst case scenario, because they jumped out the page at me as well. And I think whilst you probed the council on that point, we still have the written words from National Highways, which suggest that further modelling will need to be undergone to assess the impacts on junction 13. And I think this points to the wider point around the transport evidence base that we highlighted in our representations, that it's more slanted towards the need for mitigation to support the allocations of Thatcham and to a lesser extent Sandalwood Park, rather than seeking to benefit from the existing infrastructure in those parts of the borough where there is capacity, such as sites, and we've spoken a lot about active travel already. You know, there is capacity in parts of the borough where which are more sustainable because of their allocation, because of their location closer to the Reading urban area. So without going over those points that we made previously, all I'd say is that the evidence base is more slanted towards supporting the allocations rather than benefiting from existing transport infrastructure elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Understood. I'll come back to the council in a minute. But is there anything North East Thatcham Partnership wants to say about the transport evidence it's put in with its written statement? Very briefly.
Yeah, yes, sir. I like Mr. Ford, who introduced himself earlier from TPA, is the author of all the work, the transport work for the consortium. So I'll just let him tell you briefly what it is, including, I think, importantly, the extent to which there's new modelling or anything of that kind in the work that was put in the last. Would you deal with that one? Thanks.
Just in terms of how the trip generation was undertaken, working with WSP and West Berkshire, obviously it was using the census data and national travel statistics. So we worked out through predominantly the trips were work-based. That was the assumption that there are going to be 2 primary schools and a secondary school, so internalisation of the school trips would occur. So that obviously negates the need to sort of allow for that. There will be some movements we appreciate. We think the trip rates are robust on that basis, and like I say, it's worked through with the council extensively and with WSP, and those rates were agreed.
Did you do any new modelling?
So, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, in terms of additional modelling, all the modelling work was done by WSP. And obviously going forward, further modelling will be done. I think we appreciate, and WSP and the council appreciate, the model will need to be updated going forward with time. But at the point of time it was undertaken, it is a robust model.
So the statement that you put in to support the partnership's statement in March basically looked at the evidence that had been prepared, and you looked at it, and basically what you're saying is you're not coming to any different conclusions from your point of view.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Fine. Anything else anybody else wishes to say about transport before I go back to the council to respond to I suppose the most, yeah, Mr. Black.
Sorry, it's just a point on the crossing, if I can come back to that for 1 second.
The level crossing.
The level crossing. So just following this through, you've got the matter statement from Network Rail, which I presume that you've read, and that sets out their position on it and says that unfortunately the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study concluded that providing a bridge would encourage increases in traffic which would be unsuitable for Cookham Hill. They then pose the question, is it not the case that the provision of an additional 1,500 dwellings would be the cause for the increase in the traffic, which without a bridge would be onto the level crossing, thus exacerbating the queuing situation, which we say is absolutely the question. They then say without timely and appropriate mitigation, an urban extension to Thatcham will increase traffic, queues will become longer, more complaints will be made, and it is likely that the misuse of crossing will occur. And it then says that discussions have taken place between the parties and agreements have been made to continue to work together, and they then make reference to the statement of common ground. You have a statement of common ground that says that further work is being undertaken. We're unsure of the timing of that. We've heard some updates on that from the council. I think our position is that Network Rail say that that is appropriate mitigation. We agree that it is appropriate mitigation, and we agree that that work needs to be carried out, but it's unclear from us when that work's going to be completed and whether the council agree that that is appropriate mitigation for this level of this number of units on this site, that a bridge is appropriate mitigation.
So your reading of the various documents it's referred to is that National Rail's position is that a bridge is needed for this development.
That's our reading of it, and our reading is that that work is ongoing. So I think it's helpful for us to understand through you, sir, is that the position of the council, that that bridge is required and that's what they're working towards? Or is it that the bridge isn't required? I think we need to understand that from our position, and so do you.
Yeah, well, I
with respect,
understand
sir.
the council's position is the bridge is not required for this development. That's my understanding.
Well, Network Rail's position is that it is required. It's our understanding.
Yeah, your understanding. Yeah, Walsingham Planning.
Yes, sir, thank you. Just to add to what Mr. Black has just said there, I think the other question mark that we would have is if the bridge is required, and I would agree that Network Rail's position is that the bridge is required because there's an increase in traffic on the level crossing that has to be mitigated. And also, so sorry, the misuse that Network Rail describe is, as I understand it, a misuse that might lead to people effectively trying to jump the barriers. And Network Rail have a scoring system for the risk of misuse. And that scoring system is 1 to 13, 1 being the highest level of risk. And they score this level crossing at number 1. So it can't get any worse in terms of the risk for this level crossing. But the other question mark, sir, sorry, is if the bridge is needed, then as far as we can understand, there's no assessment or costing of what that bridge would be and what the implications in terms of what the North East Thatcham site would have to contribute to that bridge.
Well, there isn't a requirement for a bridge associated with this site. Whether there should be is another matter. Whether National Rail are saying there is different interpretations. I'll get the council to clarify. Yeah. Okay. North East Thatcham Partnership.
Sorry, so I was just trying to find you the reference to Network Rail's response, but we can come back to that. Obviously, our position is the same as Mr. Ford. There's no requirement, as we understand it, for a bridge as in association with the scheme. The only point I was going to make, so in addition, very briefly, is this topic, trip generation, mitigation, potential impacts in all the respects you've been asking about. All of the evidence is based on 2,500 units. And we'll come back to what that means and what it doesn't mean later on. But it's a singular feature, again, of this examination that much of the evidence, if not all of it, is really about the larger number, not the smaller number.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Right, okay. Council, do you want to come back on any of those? I mean, clarification of your understanding of Network Rail position has been quoted from their statement is not totally clear. I'm sure they would like a bridge, but I'm not totally convinced that they're saying it's an essential mitigation for this development and pros in the plan. And anything else you want to pick up on that's been said?
I think you've just summarised it accurately, sir. The Network Rail's position is that the crossing as it stands at the moment is the highest spec, safest crossing that any crossing can be. They've not, whilst the council and Network Rail would support a bridge, we're not saying that it's a necessary requirement, and nor is Network Rail.
Anything else about specifically the Highway Authority's view and knowledge about the additional traffic that the modelling shows will divert onto the roads through Caldash and Bucklebury in particular, or elsewhere on the local network, that has said that whilst you may have quantified that, well, disagreements about whether it's quantified correctly, but you haven't assessed it in terms of its impacts on the particular local roads in those locations, the junctions, the lack of footways, the nature of those rural roads.
Well, I was going to pick up first of all on the point about the bus, because existing use might be only 2% of the population. I'd have to check the exact numbers, but what is being proposed under any travel plan, the council would put forward the condition that a bus operated under the travel plan from the site as a shuttle bus, and that it connected the railway station and the town centre. And in other places, it's been shown that using a shuttle bus at a regular interval, which is within 450 metres of the properties on the site, people will change as an alternative if that gives them access to easier ways of getting into work. So in other words, coming down to Thatcham, coming down to be able to use the rail into west or east, east towards Reading and London, or coming into the town centre itself. So that kind of bus would increase the percentage of people using buses.
In terms of that, we'll come on to how these things are going to be secured and the timing and the relation to it. But the basic point would be that would be something that would be subsidised by the developer for a number of years. Is that correct?
That's correct. So typically, I mean, that's done as a planning condition.
Yeah. And it would be introduced at some point after so many houses have been built or occupied.
Well, from a transport policy perspective, the sooner you get it in, the sooner people's behaviour change. Trying to implement it after a certain number of houses, from our perspective, from a transport policy perspective, when you've already got some people into using cars, it's harder to make that behavioural shift than if you do it earlier. So from my perspective, earlier is better.
Yeah, thank you for that. We'll come on to what this policy says about phasing and how it actually work in practice, but understood that something like that you would want in place as early as possible for that. And in terms of the impacts on the local roads then, the rural roads through Coldash and Bucklebury and elsewhere, as Highway Authority, how can you be satisfied that you've told me you don't think that the impacts will be severe in NPPF terms or highway safety will be compromised? How do you know that if, as is said over here, you haven't done that detailed assessment?
So the work that was done that showed that traffic from the site would go northwards up through Bucklebury and Coldash, when it was modelled, the mitigation measures on the A4 were modelled. That was showing, and I'd let my colleague from WSP elaborate on this, it was showing that traffic was drawn back down onto the A4 and that reduced the northward movements up through the villages.
So it would reduce it from the unmitigated scenario, but is it the case or not that the development would be likely to lead to more traffic through Coldash and Bucklebury, even with the mitigation in place?
Yes, I think it is a statement, I think, in the probably phase 1 and phase 2 transport assessments that were based on modelling, that it's not possible to fully mitigate all of the transport impacts. It's not going to be possible to remove any increases in traffic off any of the roads in West Berkshire. But what the initial local plan modelling did, when we looked at the scenario without any highway mitigation, was you looked at, if we didn't mitigate, where would the traffic go? What are those potential impacts? And that did inform the sort of the decision to improve and change some of the junctions along the A4. There will be some impact on, or the modelling is showing impact in terms of what's been assessed. We have traffic flow plots, link delay plots, bonding capacity, link capacity and junction capacity plots, which showed where the increases and the impacts might be across the district. And those discussions led to, that led to the decision that with junction modelling necessarily wasn't needed based on the increases that we're seeing. The flows are still going to be less than 600 vehicles per hour through Upper Bucklebury and Coldash per direction.
Just to be clear then, the modelling that you did is strategic modelling. It did map out the flows where they would be through the junctions, through those villages.
Yes, they are in their forecasting reports.
Okay, they're in there. And you say that the flows through them, well, that didn't flag up any red alerts about numbers or because of the nature of those roads.
That's right. We did review them with the council and it wasn't deemed necessary.
And this figure of 600, less than 600, why is that a significant number? It's
very low in terms of road capacity and what roads can take as a single carriageway road. It's nowhere, it's not flagging up any capacity issues.
And presumably the council's highway authority is aware of existing accident spots and things like that on the local road network that you're responsible for. And there's no particular concerns about where these flows are showing in relation to things like that.
There is not, and currently the local transport plan 4 is being developed, and that's not part of the LPR. But we're confident enough that the Road Safety Department is actually looking at adopting the international vision zero standard for road accidents, rather than just talking about reductions in KPIs killed and KSIs killed and seriously injured. So the answer to that is no, we don't have any specific safety concerns in the villages north of the northeast Thatcham site.
In terms of when NPPF talks about severe impacts in terms of congestion and delay, etc., what you're saying is, well, the flows are so low, there's no issue about congestion or delays. Yeah, sorry, that's what you're saying, yeah. And in terms of highway safety, you're saying that as the council as highway authority, you're not aware of existing problems there, you don't think, or based on the flows that have been predicted and the nature of the roads that are there, that it will lead to highway safety problems.
We don't anticipate that, no.
Okay, thank you. Right, thank you. Anything else you want to say in terms of the transport? No, okay. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to come back to the shuttle bus because the shuttle bus is only useful if it goes to the destinations where people wish to go to, and it's not clear to me what significant proportion of people would want to have a destination, at least for work, in that on that route. There is at present two effectively shuttle buses running within Thatcham, the 1A and 1C, that's anti-clockwise and clockwise, which would perform the same function for the existing population. They are services subsidised by West Berkshire Council, and neither of them go to the station, which suggests that the currently it's not regarded as a significant mitigation measure. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Are you about to move off transport infrastructure, sir?
I'm about to move on to the transport improvements and mitigations infrastructure, yes. So I'm not away from transport, but just I've tried to look at the first set of issues there were about what the evidence tells us about the flows, etc., some impacts. So now I'm going to look at what the plan actually proposes in terms of transport improvements and mitigations. I don't know if someone's got a control of the air conditioning in this room, or it's a sort of automatic system, but it seems to verge from being cold air coming to hot air coming. And I don't know, is that someone playing with the button, or is it just how it works? That's how it works. Okay. Yeah, well, that's one way of putting it, I suppose. Yeah. Right. Okay. If you took an average, I suppose we'd all be very comfortable. Shows what statistics can show, doesn't it? Right. Okay. So in terms of the transport improvements and mitigations, one of the bits of the overall picture is that to some degree the traffic flows outside the site will be reduced by the provision of services, local services within the site, and the layout of development to facilitate easy access to those from the different residential areas. That's one of the ideas behind it, yeah. And that's factored in, though, presumably to what we've just been talking about, the flows that were done. So that, okay, understood. So, and then the design and layout, yeah, would encourage both the active travel within the site, but also across the A4 and Floral Way to the town centre and the train station as being key destinations. Obviously, people who want to go on the motorway to wherever, they're going to go on the motorway to wherever, and they'll find a way there to do that. So that's understood. But but those sort of ideas about the cycle routes, walking routes, shuttle buses to certain places, you think could be effective in terms of picking up some of the journeys. Right. In terms of the policy, obviously I'm looking at what's been submitted, but there's been some changes and I referred earlier to Appendix A. So I've got a track changes version of the policy, which is very helpful. And in terms of the section on transport, there's a bit of clarification provided, but not a massive amount of change. But what it does do, it refers to how the transport strategy that needs to be prepared. And it basically says development proposal need to be supported by that. And there's a couple of additional points about multiple access points and air quality management plan being provided. So in terms of the multiple access points and the vehicle through route, we have the plan that you've submitted with the Appendix A, which is the proposed new site plan. And that would replace the one that's in the plan. And this has the access points onto the existing roads, mainly to the south, the main roads, but also it's Harts Hill Road, is it? The one that goes north-south. Okay, so whilst that, and they reflect the evidence that you've got, it's not prescriptive as such, but it's making the point in the policy that it's going to be something of that nature of various points going into it. And in terms of a through route to the site, what does that actually mean? Would that mean a loop road in effect that would go from the westernmost access point from, is it Floral Way, to the roundabout at Colthrop? Is that what would be provided? Is that what's envisaged when you talk about a through route?
I think that's the principle of it.
Yeah.
Where it goes in and comes out would obviously be subject to the detailed negotiation at planning application stage. But in effect, yes, you should be able to drive from the east of the site to the west of the site without having to come out and go round.
So that would be for all traffic. That would be cars and buses.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And walking and cycling
Yeah.
routes as well.
Well, or they could be part of that one route, but they
could be separate.
segregated and separate through whatever else. Okay, so in terms of the specific transport improvements that would be funded by the developer, and these would be worked up in detail through the master planning process and the planning application. So there'd be obviously the links onto the existing road network and the road through the site. Yep. There would be the pedestrian and cycle improvements and provision at access points to the site. So that's getting across the existing roads as well as whatever's provided within the site. Then these capacity improvements to Floral Way and along the A4 corridor. And then, the pedestrian and cycle crossing routes in a number of specified locations. And they are referred to in general terms in the policy, but not specifically itemised as you've described them in your statement. Yep.
Yes, that's correct.
But they're the main things.
Yes.
And the costs of those, there's a figure of 22 million that is in the IDP, I think. Excuse me. And you're satisfied that's still a reasonably accurate figure for the package of things that is expected to be required?
Yes.
In broad terms?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The issue of the M4 junction 13, there's nothing that has been said in relation to National Highways work that's adding anything to that. Right. And in terms of how these would be delivered, you obviously got the slight tweak to the SP17 in terms of the transport strategy, but that was there already. Subject to that, there's the other policies in the plan, which are SP23, SP24 and DM42, which are about providing transport and other infrastructure. But then you've got the process of the master plan and then the planning application, the use of planning conditions and other legal agreements to secure it all. I'll come on to phasing under the later matter and how it all works in detail. But in terms of transport in particular, and it was referenced already to having to introduce things early on to affect behaviour, what in broad terms does the council have in mind in terms of the transport infrastructure provision and the timing of the residential development?
And it's a case of we would have to consider at the planning application stage when we know what measures are actually being proposed. Yes, as my colleague said, certain things need to be put in before you can start building houses, other things are acceptable at a certain point when there's a certain number of houses. But that's not something we've considered at this stage. We are content that the infrastructure can be delivered as and when it's required, but the detail of that would be up to at the planning application stage.
So in terms of something like a shuttle bus then, I mean, development may start in one area or it may in two, I don't know. But you won't get, for example, you won't get the link road across the site presumably until, well, you're not going to get it before any of the houses are built, I wouldn't have thought, are you? No, it'll be built as the houses are built, presumably.
Yes.
But could a scenario occur that you could get a shuttle bus operating from before that link road's put through?
I mean, yes, you could. It would be, we'd have to discuss the details of that when we're discussing the application and what that shuttle bus would look like, if that's the measure that's included, and if that's the measure that's proposed. And with existing bus routes in the area, you could divert an existing route to pick up certain things until it's, enough development on the site to have that through route.
When you say you could divert an existing route, service, can the council control that?
To a certain extent we can, because we subsidise quite a lot of our bus routes.
Right, and therefore you can require the operator to do something.
It would be negotiation as part of the contracts that are going on. Colleagues might be better placed.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I was going to say, yes, we can do that. And also bus routes are being constantly re-looked at because you've got things like the Transport for the South East Master Plan, their list of schemes. And one of their ambitions for both Newbury to Basingstoke and also Newbury to Reading is to increase the frequency of existing services.
So in general terms, are the bus services in West Berkshire doing okay, and they're being improved rather than being cut back, or?
There's just been a renewal of contract with the existing supplier at the existing rates and no cutback. As far as patronage goes, patronage is running about 80% of pre-COVID, but that's more to do with people working from home. Weekend journeys are up, and the £2 fare scheme has had quite a significant impact on people coming back onto the buses.
Okay, so a site like this, you think it's entirely realistic to expect it to be served by buses from early on, basically what you're saying?
I think that there's still commercial services like the Jet Black running between Newbury and Reading, that is fully commercial, not subsidised at all. And they'd recognise the commercial potential of taking buses through the site, I'm sure.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Right, so by way, I mean, one of the exam documents you was submitted was the appeal decision for the Sandalford Park. Is it west or east? East, isn't it? And that has a lot of planning conditions and section. But I mean, just in terms of a kind of an approach to how secure infrastructure and things through that, I could look at an example like that and see that's the sort of process you have in mind, yeah?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Right, okay. Anything else you want to say about what SP 17 actually says about delivering the transport improvements and mitigations? As I say, we'll come back to the phasing and some of the master planning later, but in broad terms, I understood. Right, Mr. Pike.
Thank you, sir. Just going back to the buses, give a bit more detail. I was probably the only person who actually arrived this morning by one of those buses from Thatcham. So we have the Jet Black or one which runs between Newbury and Reading. Peak duration, I think, is typically half an hour. There may be slightly more frequent in the rush hours. One of the key questions there is the time it takes to get to Reading. So having diversions will reduce the attractiveness for the existing passengers. The 1A and 1C, which are the subsidised ones, do a circuit anti-clockwise and clockwise around Thatcham, and they have a time of 55 minutes once an hour each way. And therefore increasing that may affect the timetable and therefore the number of buses that would be required. So it's, and again, reduce the appeal for people because you're adding an extra loop into the journey, which is already in some cases quite lengthy. So that's a consideration, as well as just it swings and roundabouts. You're providing a service for some and reducing it to others. Thank you.
So are you saying that you don't think that could be an effective bus service serving a site like this?
So, well, one question, it depends which end of the site is developed first. So part of the site is adjacent to the A4 and could be served easily. The other part is a substantial loop for the one service, and the 1A and 1C don't cut round inside Thatcham, and that would be quite a detour to reach the site. So I'm not an expert on buses, but it's not a natural thing that could easily be done. It's quite a major change which has an impact on the existing users. Thank you.
Okay. North East Thatcham Partnership.
Thank you. So just to come back on that bus point, bus is obviously a very important part of the overall concept. And there is the Jet Black, which is the commercial service, which runs between Newbury and Reading. We're not at the moment envisaging a shuttle bus per se, even though that's something no doubt that will be discussed at the application stage. It's at the moment more likely that, given the way things are being discussed, an additional extension of the 1A/1C services, and that's to combat, to get those loops into the site and not to affect the frequency and therefore put people off existing patronage off. And so that will almost certainly involve an additional bus into that system. That's the way that it's being considered at the moment, additional bus within that system, in the subsidised part of the bus system in Thatcham. That does bring with it, sir, implications about the funding of that service, which go back to, you won't be surprised to hear me say my favourite point about the overall housing numbers, because it's always been assessed on the basis of 2,500. And I'll just ask Mr. Ford very, very briefly, sir, just to tell you about where that point goes, because it is quite important given the importance of the buses.
Yes, and in terms of a new bus service, it's approximately £150,000 a year to operate as a single bus, give or take, obviously operational costs, etc. But that's sort of the average used across the country at the moment. And just looking at the potential bus patronage using census data and national travel statistics, we can work out what the population of the site could be, therefore the household population, the working population, and those in employment, etc., etc. And then using obviously existing mode share from the site or the area around the site to forecast the number of people that could be actually travelling to and from the site, taking into account potential leisure trips per person, school trips per person, and shopping and personal business trips per person over the average year. But so for 1,500 houses, that's likely to generate an income of around about £122,000, whereas 2,000 units would generate 162,000, which would make an additional bus more viable, and 2,500 units would generate just over £200,000 in revenue, which obviously make the bus service and additional works more viable for the site.
So that comes back just to where the evidence is on this. We've got plenty of evidence about 2,500 and the bus working, which is where we've been going. What you don't have, sir, is evidence from anybody, including from West Berks, that this important bus service would work if only 1,500 units came forward on the site.
That's the long-term commercial viability of a bus service is what you're talking about there.
Yeah, ensuring that there's a feasible, viable, deliverable additional loop through the site. Absolutely.
I mean, in the short term, developer subsidising it to get it off the ground, well, that's something you presume you factor in as a cost for the developer, but that's what you're talking about here is the long-term commercial.
Absolutely, the plan-making aspect of it. I mean, obviously, you'll need to consider, because it's a large strategic site, how the application would go if and when the site's allocated, because the shape of the 106 and what's in the 106 and the trigger points are obviously critical to the grant of planning permission. So if it's not going to be long-term viable because of the housing numbers and the revenue, then that has a major effect, obviously, on how the thing comes forward, which is why it's a plan-making point and not just an application point.
Okay. Right, thank you. Any other points on transport? Anything you want to say before we finish on that? Yes, Thatcham.
Yeah, just draw your attention to the point that we made in our matter for representations, that in the HELAR for the site north of Thatcham, there's a reference to the need for part of that land to be reserved for road improvements should the North East Thatcham site go ahead. There's a reference in our document. So that suggests that that at some point there was deemed to be a requirement for road improvements, which has got lost in the subsequent documentation. But it's clear in the HELAR for that other site that it was. I'll try and give you the reference. Or
so the site we're talking about.
This is the one. We call it as Regency Park. It's the one to the north of Thatcham towards Coldash. That site, the HELAR assessment before it was rejected said that part of the land adjacent to Heath Lane would need to be reserved for road improvement should THA 20 proceed. So
TH 20 being
the northeast Thatcham.
Right.
Thank you. So that evidence is there that there was a need, that at some point there was a thought to be a need for a road improvement, which seems to have got lost in the later documentation.
When you say it's got lost, you mean someone's forgotten about it?
Yeah, it's not been referenced. It's not been mentioned in any of the subsequent transport studies. But at some point there was there was believed to be a clear need for that road to be improved, which I would agree to. Thank you.
But can I not assume that there's no longer a need for it because it's not referred to anywhere now?
I don't think the studies have got that have addressed that section of road in that detail, because that's part of the northeast Thatcham loop, the distributor road beyond the road up to Coldash. So I don't think that's been part of that.
Sorry, what distributor road up to Coldash?
That's Flora Way round to Tollway. That loop, it includes two existing sections of road, including Heath Lane, which was one of the ones that was suggested needed to be improved.
Okay. Do you want to comment on that? This lost bit of road improvement?
We need to go back and have a look at it to work out before we reply, because we don't quite know what's being referred to. So we need to check, but we can do that and get back to you.
Can I not assume that it hasn't been?
We don't think there's an issue, and it seems to be related to the Regency Park assessment rather than to North East Thatcham in particular. So we don't, the transport stuff for North East Thatcham has been assessed as it is. And as we've demonstrated already this morning, we're not anticipating the need for anything new. But if you want us to come back on Mr. Pike's point, we can have a look at it.
So, but the assessment for North East Thatcham was done part of the assessment for all of the allocations in the plan?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
But not the ones that were dropped out because they weren't?
No, so it's an assessment at an earlier stage where that comment's been made. So yeah, time has moved on since that assessment would have been written.
Right, okay. Councillor Reid?
Just a reference to buses again. So the local healthcare centre for Bucklebury, which I suspect the new residents of North East Thatcham may have to use until other facilities are put in place, is up at Chapel Row. Now, actually, if you're taking a bus there, you can get one of 3 buses there. But in reality, on the bus return, you're going to have to wait until 5:10 in order to get back from the surgery. And there really isn't a lot to keep you amused in Chapel Road, other than walking. But I suspect you wouldn't be going to the doctors if you were fit enough to walk.
Understood. Okay, thank you. Thatcham Town Council, your sign's up now. Thank you. It's all right. Right, I think it is 5 to 1 now. Unless there's anything else on transport, I think what we'll do, we'll break now. So, and we'll move on to the other infrastructure after lunch. Obviously, we could resume at 2 o'clock, but if people would wish to start a little earlier, I'm happy to do that. I would look for, I mean, people have got to go off to get something to eat. Sorry, you're nodding.
If we could start early, that would be helpful.
Okay, fine, understood. Okay, shall we say 10 to 2? So just under an hour to give people a chance for a break. I mean, in terms of how we order things, I don't suppose we can deal with health infrastructure next, if you prefer. Then you can leave after that if that's what you wish to do. So I can, rejig. I can do health next and leave education till after health. So should we deal with that?
Thank you, sir. That would be most useful.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Black.
I think so. It would be helpful if we could deal with biodiversity today, because we've got Mr. Gurry up here. If we could get to that.
Well, I'm going to deal with the infrastructure. So we've got the education, health and community. And then I'm happy to deal with, I put biodiversity immediately after landscape and green infrastructure, but I'm happy to do the biodiversity before the landscape if that makes a difference.
That would be helpful as well,
yeah.
sir.
Okay. Right, any other bids for moving the agenda around? Yes,
Sorry, can I just confirm whether you needed transport after lunch or not, or you're completely done with us now?
no, I'm finished with transport for now, anyway. Thank you. Right, okay, so if we resume at 10 to 2, please. Thank you.